walked into the grand hall with torn clothes, surrounded by nobles draped in gold. The prince laughed, but in that moment, something happened that would change everything he thought he knew about honor, beauty, and destiny. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The winter wind howled through the narrow streets of Thornwick, a village nestled in the northern reaches of medieval England, where the cold bit deeper than anywhere else in the kingdom. The sky hung heavy with gray clouds that promised snow, and the bare branches of ancient oak trees clawed at the air like skeletal fingers. In a small cottage at the edge of the village, where the thatched roof sagged with age and the wooden walls bore the scars of countless winters, a young woman knelt beside a dying fire, her slender fingers working to coax warmth from the last few pieces of kindling. Her name was Isadora, and though poverty had marked her life with its cruel hand, it had not managed to diminish the striking beauty that made even the hardest hearts pause. Her hair fell in waves of deep chestnut brown, catching what little light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, and her eyes held the color of spring meadows, a vibrant green that seemed out of place in the bleakness of her surroundings. Her skin, though pale from lack of proper nourishment, possessed a luminous quality that no amount of hardship could fully extinguish. She wore a dress of rough-spun wool, patched in so many places that it was difficult to tell where the original fabric ended and the repairs began, and her feet were wrapped in cloth strips that served as makeshift shoes. "Mother, please drink this," Isadora whispered, turning from the fire with a wooden cup in her hands. The liquid inside was little more than hot water with a few herbs she had managed to gather from the frozen ground outside, but it was all she had to offer. On a narrow bed in the corner of the cottage lay Margaret, Isadora's mother, a woman who had once been known throughout Thornwick for her gentle spirit and kind heart. Now, illness had wasted her frame to little more than skin and bone, and her breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that filled Isadora with a fear she could barely contain. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, and she managed a weak smile that broke her daughter's heart. "You are too good to me, my sweet girl," Margaret murmured, her voice barely audible above the wind that seeped through every crack in the cottage walls. "You should not waste what little we have on an old woman who is already walking toward the next world." "Do not speak like that," Isadora said firmly, though tears threatened at the corners of her eyes. She helped her mother sit up enough to take a few sips from the cup, supporting her with an arm that trembled not from weakness, but from the fierce determination to keep the only family she had left in this world. "You are not old, and you are not leaving me. Tomorrow I will go to the marketplace and find work. Someone must need help with something, and I will earn enough to buy proper medicine and food." Margaret shook her head slowly, knowing better than her daughter the reality of their situation. In Thornwick, work was scarce even for the healthy and strong, and for a young woman with no connections and no dowry, the options were fewer still. The village had been struggling for years under the heavy taxes imposed by the crown, and tensions between the nobility and the common folk had grown so thick you could almost taste them in the air like smoke from a distant fire. "There is something I must tell you," Margaret said after taking another small sip of the herbal water. Her eyes took on a distant quality, as if she were looking into the past rather than at her daughter's worried face. "Something I should have told you long ago, but I was afraid. I was always afraid of what it might mean for you." Isadora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping through the cottage walls. "Mother, whatever it is, it can wait until you are stronger." "No, it cannot," Margaret insisted, her thin fingers clutching at Isadora's hand with surprising strength. "If something happens to me, you need to know the truth about who you are and where you came from. Your father was not a simple farmer, as I told you all these years." The revelation hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Isadora found herself unable to speak, unable to do anything but stare at the woman who had raised her with love despite their poverty and hardship. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters with increased fury, as if the very elements themselves were reacting to this moment of truth. "Your father," Margaret continued, her voice growing weaker with each word, "was a man of noble birth, though I can say no more than that. He loved me truly, I believe that even now, but his family would never have accepted our union. When I discovered I was carrying you, he gave me what money he could and begged me to leave the capital, to go somewhere far away where his family's influence could not reach. I came here to Thornwick, where no one knew me, and I built this life for us with the little he provided. But that money ran out years ago, and I have never asked him for more. Never tried to contact him, because I feared what might happen if his family learned of your existence." Isadora's mind reeled with this information, turning over the implications like stones in a tumbler. All her life she had believed herself to be the daughter of a farmer who had died before she was born. A simple story that explained her existence and asked no uncomfortable questions. Now, suddenly, her entire understanding of herself had been upended, replaced with a mystery that raised more questions than it answered. "Who is he?" Isadora asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "My father. Who is he?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears that traced silver paths down her hollow cheeks. "That is something I can never tell you, my darling girl. I made a promise, and even now, even facing death itself, I cannot break it. All I can say is that you carry noble blood in your veins, and perhaps if the world were different, if circumstances had been kinder, you might have known a very different life." Before Isadora could press for more information, a violent coughing fit seized her mother, racking her frail body with spasms that seemed likely to tear her apart. Isadora held her close, murmuring words of comfort and feeling utterly helpless in the face of this disease that was stealing her mother away piece by piece. When the coughing finally subsided, Margaret lay back against the thin pillow, exhausted and barely conscious. The next morning brought no improvement in Margaret's condition, and Isadora knew that her earlier words about finding work were not just hopeful thinking, but absolute necessity. She dressed in her least tattered dress, though calling it such was generous, and wrapped herself in a thin cloak that did little to ward off the biting cold. Before leaving, she made sure her mother had water within reach and added what little wood remained to the fire. The marketplace of Thornwick was a sorry sight, especially compared to what Isadora imagined the great markets of London or York might be. A few stalls sold meager produce, root vegetables mostly, and some dried meat that looked as tough as leather. The merchants who tended these stalls wore expressions as grim as the weather, and the customers who moved among them did so with the defeated air of people who had long since given up hope for better days. Isadora approached each stall in turn, asking if they needed help with anything, willing to do whatever work might be available. Each time, she was met with shaking heads and words of refusal, sometimes accompanied by looks of pity that stung worse than outright scorn. By midday, her feet ached from walking on the frozen ground, and her stomach cramped with hunger, but she had not earned a single coin. It was then that she noticed the commotion near the village square. A group of riders had entered Thornwick, their horses' hooves clattering against the cobblestones with a rhythm that spoke of wealth and power. The riders wore fine cloaks of deep blue wool trimmed with gray fur, and their horses were magnificent beasts that made the farm animals of the village look like broken-down nags by comparison. At the head of this group rode a man who could only be a royal messenger, given the emblem emblazoned on his tunic, the 3 lions of England rendered in gold thread that caught what little sunlight managed to break through the clouds. The messenger dismounted with practiced ease and unrolled a scroll while the villagers gathered around, their curiosity overcoming their usual wariness of anything connected to the crown. Isadora moved closer, drawn by the same curiosity, though she kept to the edges of the crowd, all too aware of how her shabby appearance marked her as one of the poorest among them. "By decree of His Majesty, King Edmund III," the messenger's voice rang out clear and strong, "and by the request of His Royal Highness Prince Theodore, a grand ball is to be held at Ravencrest Castle 1 week hence. In a gesture of goodwill and unity, this celebration shall be open to all subjects of the realm, from the highest lord to the humblest peasant. All who wish to attend are welcome, provided they come in their finest attire and conduct themselves with the dignity befitting such an occasion." A murmur ran through the crowd, a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Such invitations were unheard of in the common memory of Thornwick. The nobility rarely mixed with common folk except when collecting taxes or enforcing laws, and the idea that a prince would open his celebration to peasants seemed almost too fantastical to believe. "Why would the prince do such a thing?" someone in the crowd called out, voicing the question on everyone's mind. The messenger's expression remained neutral, professional. "His Royal Highness Prince Theodore believes that a kingdom is only as strong as the unity between all its people. This ball is meant to foster understanding and connection between the nobility and the common folk. It is a new era, or so the prince hopes to make it." As the messenger continued with details about the date and time, Isadora found her thoughts drifting to her mother's revelation from the night before. Noble blood, Margaret had said, though she refused to name Isadora's father. Could he be among the nobles who would attend this ball? Might Isadora see him there? Recognize something of herself in his features, even if she could never claim him as her father? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, and Isadora knew it was foolish besides. She had no fine attire to wear, no way to make herself presentable for such an event, and even if she did, what would be the point? She was a peasant girl with a dying mother and not a coin to her name. Dreams of balls and princes and discovering noble fathers were luxuries she could not afford. Yet as she walked back to the cottage that afternoon, empty-handed and heavy-hearted, she could not quite shake the idea. What if she could somehow attend? What if this ball might offer some opportunity, some chance to change her circumstances? Her mother needed medicine, needed food, needed things that Isadora had no means of providing. Perhaps at the ball, she might meet someone who could help, someone with the means and the compassion to assist a poor family in need. That evening, as she sat beside her mother's bed and told her about the messenger and the prince's invitation, Margaret's eyes took on a strange light, something that might have been hope or might have been fear. "You should go," Margaret whispered, her voice so faint that Isadora had to lean close to hear. "You should attend this ball, my daughter. Perhaps it is fate, perhaps it is the gods giving you a chance that I never had. Mother, I cannot leave you alone, and besides, I have nothing suitable to wear. Look at me. I would be laughed out of the castle before I even reached the doors." Margaret's thin hand reached out and grasped Isadora's with surprising strength. "In the chest at the foot of my bed there is something I have kept hidden all these years. A dress, the one I wore when I met your father. It is old now, but it was fine once, made of good fabric and sewn with care. Take it, alter it if you must, and wear it to the ball. If nothing else, you will have one night to see how the other half lives, to experience something beyond these four walls and this endless struggle." Isadora wanted to protest further, but something in her mother's eyes stopped her. Margaret needed this, needed to believe that her daughter might have a chance at something better. And who was Isadora to deny her that small comfort? With trembling hands, she opened the old chest and found, beneath layers of worn blankets and threadbare linens, a dress wrapped in cloth to protect it from moths and dust. When she unfolded it, Isadora gasped. The dress was made of deep emerald silk, a color that would complement her eyes perfectly, with delicate embroidery along the bodice and sleeves done in silver thread that had tarnished slightly with age, but still held a ghostly beauty. It was indeed old-fashioned by current standards, the style belonging to a previous generation, but the quality of the craftsmanship was undeniable. This had been an expensive garment once, the kind of thing that Margaret could never have afforded on her own. "He gave it to me," Margaret explained, watching her daughter examine the dress with wonder in her eyes. "Your father, he wanted me to have something beautiful, something that would remind me that he cared, even if we could not be together. I wore it only once, the night before I left the capital, and then I put it away, unable to bear looking at it because it reminded me of everything I had lost." Over the next week, Isadora divided her time between caring for her mother and working on the dress, altering it to fit her slimmer frame and updating some of the styling to make it less obviously outdated. She had learned to sew from Margaret, who had once worked as a seamstress before illness made such fine work impossible, and her fingers proved nimble at the task. She let out seams here, took in fabric there, and added small touches of her own, using scraps of ribbon she had saved over the years to refresh the trim. Margaret's condition did not improve, but neither did it worsen significantly, and she seemed to draw strength from watching her daughter prepare for the ball, living vicariously through Isadora's nervous excitement. They talked more in that week than they had in months, with Margaret sharing stories of her youth in the capital, careful always to avoid any details that might reveal the identity of Isadora's father, but painting vivid pictures of court life and noble society that made Isadora's head spin with the strangeness of it all. The night before the ball, as Isadora laid out the finished dress and tried to imagine herself wearing it among nobles and royalty, a storm of anxiety churned in her stomach. What was she thinking? She was a peasant, completely out of her depth, and no amount of silk and embroidery could change that fundamental fact. She would be recognized for what she was the moment she opened her mouth, the moment she made some error in etiquette or protocol that would mark her as an outsider. "You are brave," Margaret said from her bed, as if reading her daughter's thoughts.
"Braver than I ever was, and you deserve this chance, this one night to be something more than what this cruel world has made you. Go to the ball, hold your head high, and remember that you carry noble blood in your veins, even if no one else knows it." The morning of the ball dawned cold and clear, with frost coating every surface in Thornwick like a blanket of crushed diamonds.
Isadora woke before sunrise, her heart already racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread that made her stomach twist into knots. She moved quietly through the cottage, not wanting to disturb her mother, who had finally fallen into a peaceful sleep after a restless night plagued by coughing fits. The journey to Ravencrest Castle would take most of the day on foot, as Isadora had no horse and certainly no coin to hire transport. She had planned to leave early, giving herself plenty of time to arrive before the ball began at sunset. The dress lay carefully folded in a cloth bag that she would carry with her, along with a small portion of bread and cheese that represented nearly the last of their food stores. She would change into the gown once she reached the castle, not wanting to risk soiling it on the long walk through the winter countryside. Before departing, Isadora knelt beside her mother's bed and gently touched Margaret's shoulder. The older woman's eyes fluttered open, and despite the pallor of her skin and the shadows beneath her eyes, she managed a warm smile that reminded Isadora of happier times, of childhood days when her mother's love had been enough to keep the darkness of poverty at bay. "You are leaving now?" Margaret asked, her voice hoarse but steady. "It is still so early, my darling." "The walk is long, Mother, and I want to arrive with time to spare. I have left water by your bedside and added wood to the fire. I will return tomorrow morning with stories to tell you, stories that will make you laugh and forget, even for a moment, the pain that troubles you so." Margaret reached up and cupped Isadora's face with a hand that trembled slightly, her eyes searching her daughter's features as if trying to memorize every detail. "You are so beautiful, just like your father." He had eyes that could see into a person's soul, eyes that made you believe the world could be better than it was. "You have those same eyes, Isadora, and I pray that tonight you will use them to see the possibilities that exist beyond these cottage walls, beyond this life of struggle and want." Tears threatened to spill down Isadora's cheeks, but she blinked them back, not wanting her mother to see her cry. "I will make you proud, Mother. I promise. You already have, every single day of your life. Now go, before I start weeping like a foolish old woman and make you late for your grand adventure." Isadora kissed her mother's forehead, lingering for a moment to breathe in the familiar scent of the herbs she had been using to treat Margaret's illness, then forced herself to stand and walk toward the door. She wrapped herself in her threadbare cloak, picked up the bag containing the dress, and stepped out into the freezing morning air. She did not look back, knowing that if she did, she might lose her resolve and stay, and Margaret would never forgive her for missing this opportunity. The road to Ravencrest Castle wound through the English countryside, following ancient paths that had been traveled by countless feet over hundreds of years. In summer these roads would have been pleasant, lined with wildflowers and shaded by leafy trees, but in the depths of winter they were harsh and unforgiving. Ice made the ground treacherous, and the wind cut through Isadora's thin cloak as if it were made of paper rather than wool. As she walked, Isadora let her mind wander to thoughts of what the evening might hold. She imagined the castle filled with light and music, with tables groaning under the weight of food she had only heard about in stories, delicacies that peasants like herself never tasted. She pictured the nobles in their fine clothing, the ladies in gowns that would make her altered silk dress look like a beggar's rags, and the gentlemen in doublets and cloaks trimmed with fur and fastened with jeweled brooches. And then there was the prince himself, Prince Theodore, the man who had extended this unprecedented invitation to the common folk. What manner of man was he? The rumors that had filtered down to Thornwick painted him as something of an enigma. Some said he was kind and progressive, genuinely interested in improving the lives of his future subjects. Others whispered that he was arrogant and capricious, that this ball was nothing more than a whim, a way to amuse himself by watching peasants stumble through the rituals of noble society. Isadora had no way of knowing which rumors held truth and which were merely speculation, but she found herself curious despite her better judgment. A prince who would open his doors to commoners was either remarkably enlightened or remarkably foolish, and she suspected the evening would reveal which. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Isadora continued her journey, marking the passage of time with its weak winter light. She passed through several small villages, each as poor and struggling as Thornwick, where people looked at her with suspicious eyes, wondering what would drive a young woman to walk alone on such a cold day. She did not stop to explain, keeping her head down and her pace steady, driven by a determination that surprised even herself. It was mid-afternoon when Ravencrest Castle finally came into view, rising from the landscape like something out of a legend. The castle sat atop a hill, its gray stone walls and towers stark against the winter sky, with banners flying from the battlements that snapped and billowed in the wind. Even from a distance, Isadora could see that it was a formidable structure, built for defense as much as for comfort, with thick walls and narrow windows that spoke of centuries of conflict and conquest. As she drew closer, the true scale of the castle became apparent. It was massive, far larger than anything Isadora had imagined, with multiple courtyards and buildings connected by covered walkways. Guards stood at regular intervals along the walls, their armor gleaming dully in the afternoon light. And the main gate stood open, though more guards were posted there, checking the credentials of those who sought entrance. Isadora's steps slowed as she approached the gate, suddenly acutely aware of how she must appear to these armored sentries. Her cloak was patched and stained, her shoes were worn nearly through, and her face bore the marks of cold and exhaustion from the long walk. She looked exactly like what she was, a peasant girl who had no business being anywhere near a royal ball. But before the guards could question her presence, another group of people arrived, clearly common folk from the surrounding area who had also accepted the prince's invitation. They wore their best clothes, which were still obviously the garments of working people, but they carried themselves with an air of excited nervousness that Isadora recognized in herself. The guards waved this group through with minimal scrutiny, and Isadora attached herself to the edge of the crowd, slipping past the gate without being directly challenged. Once inside the outer courtyard, Isadora separated from the group and looked around for somewhere private to change into the silk dress. She could not attend the ball in her current state, and she needed time to transform herself from a travel-worn peasant into something approaching a presentable guest. She spotted a small building that appeared to be a gardener's shed, tucked away in a corner of the courtyard where few people were passing, and made her way there quickly. Inside the shed, among tools and pots and bags of soil, Isadora removed her worn clothing and carefully pulled the emerald silk dress over her head. The fabric felt impossibly soft against her skin, a luxury she had never experienced before, and as she fastened the laces and smoothed the skirt, she caught a glimpse of herself in a small, dusty mirror that hung on the wall. For a moment, she did not recognize the woman looking back at her. The dress transformed her completely. The deep green brought out the color of her eyes and complemented her chestnut hair, which she had braided and coiled in a style she remembered seeing in a painting once, simple but elegant. The cut of the gown emphasized her slender waist and the graceful line of her neck, and the silver embroidery caught what light filtered through the shed's single window, glinting like starlight. She looked for all the world like a young noblewoman, perhaps not of the highest rank, but certainly not a peasant. Yet, as Isadora studied her reflection more closely, she noticed the small imperfections that might give her away to a discerning eye. The dress, though beautiful, was clearly old-fashioned, and there were places where her stitching showed, where she had altered the garment to fit. Her hands bore calluses from years of hard work, and her skin lacked the pampered softness of a woman who had never known manual labor. Most tellingly, she had no jewelry, no adornments beyond the dress itself, and every noblewoman would be draped in gold and gems. For a long moment Isadora considered abandoning the entire endeavor. She could change back into her peasant clothes, slip out of the castle grounds, and return to Thornwick without anyone being the wiser. Her mother need never know that she had lost her nerve at the last moment, and Isadora could spare herself the humiliation of being exposed as an impostor among people who would never accept her as an equal. But then she remembered her mother's words from that morning, about having eyes that could see possibilities, about being brave enough to reach for something better. Margaret was dying, and she would likely not live to see another spring. This night, this one foolish adventure, might be the only gift Isadora could give her, the only story worth telling that might bring light to her mother's final days. For Margaret's sake, if not her own, Isadora had to see this through. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Isadora hid her peasant clothes in the shed and emerged into the courtyard, walking with her head held high and her shoulders back. trying to project a confidence she did not feel. Other guests were arriving now in greater numbers, and she joined the flow of people making their way toward the great hall where the ball was to be held. The great hall of Ravencrest Castle was beyond anything Isadora's imagination could have conjured. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by massive wooden beams carved with intricate designs, and the walls were hung with tapestries depicting scenes of battles and hunts and courtly life. Hundreds of candles blazed in iron chandeliers, casting a warm golden light that seemed almost magical after the gray dimness of winter outside. Tables lined the walls, laden with food that made Isadora's empty stomach clench with hunger. Roasted meats and fresh bread and pastries that gleamed with honey and sugar. Musicians played in a corner, their instruments creating melodies that Isadora had never heard before, complex and beautiful, and nobles danced in the center of the hall, moving through steps that seemed as choreographed as any military formation. The dancers wore gowns of silk and velvet in every color imaginable, deep burgundies and rich blues and brilliant golds, all trimmed with fur and embroidered with thread that sparkled in the candlelight. The men were equally resplendent in doublets of fine wool and leather, with cloaks that swirled as they moved and boots that shone like mirrors. Isadora pressed herself against a wall, trying to make herself small and invisible, overwhelmed by the sheer opulence of everything around her. She felt like an intruder, a fraud, and she was certain that at any moment someone would point at her and shout for the guards to remove the peasant girl who dared to pretend she belonged in such company. But no one paid her any attention. The nobles were too absorbed in their own conversations and pleasures, and the few common folk who had accepted the prince's invitation seemed equally awed and out of place, clustering together in small groups and speaking in hushed whispers. Isadora realized that her dress, old-fashioned though it might be, was fine enough that people assumed she was minor nobility from some distant estate, someone not worth noting or approaching. As she stood there, trying to decide whether to flee or to at least sample some of the magnificent food before leaving, a commotion at the far end of the hall drew everyone's attention. The musicians fell silent, and the dancers stopped mid-step, turning as one toward the grand staircase that descended from the upper floors of the castle. A herald in royal livery stepped forward and raised a brass horn to his lips, blowing a fanfare that echoed through the hall and silenced even the most determined conversationalists. His Royal Highness, Prince Theodore of England, heir to the throne and Lord of Ravencrest, the herald announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the great hall. Isadora found herself craning her neck along with everyone else, curious to catch a glimpse of the prince who had made this extraordinary evening possible. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat, though whether from surprise or something else entirely, she could not have said. Prince Theodore descended the stairs with the easy confidence of someone who had been born to command attention, and command it he did. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of hours spent training with sword and lance, and he moved with a warrior's grace that made even the simple act of walking downstairs look like a performance. His hair was dark, almost black, and fell to his shoulders in waves that framed a face of striking masculine beauty, all strong angles and aristocratic features. He wore a doublet of midnight blue velvet embroidered with gold thread in patterns that suggested lions and roses, the symbols of English royalty, and a cloak of thick gray fur was fastened at his shoulder with a brooch of gold and sapphires. But it was his eyes that truly captured Isadora's attention, even from across the crowded hall. They were a startling shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds over the ocean, and they held an intensity that seemed at odds with the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This was a man who missed nothing, who saw through pretense and facades, and Isadora felt a flutter of fear that those penetrating eyes might somehow see through her carefully constructed appearance to the desperate peasant girl beneath. The prince reached the bottom of the stairs and immediately began moving through the crowd, greeting nobles by name and exchanging pleasantries with the ease of long practice. He stopped to speak with a group of elderly lords, then moved on to compliment a lady on her gown, each interaction brief but apparently genuine, as if he truly cared about these people and their opinions. As Prince Theodore made his circuit of the hall, gradually working his way closer to where Isadora stood frozen against the wall, she noticed something that the other guests seemed to miss. For all his charm and grace, there was a weariness in the prince's eyes, a tension in the set of his shoulders that suggested he was playing a role rather than simply being himself. He smiled and laughed at appropriate moments, but the humor never quite reached those storm cloud eyes, and Isadora recognized in him something of her own performance, the act of pretending to be someone you were not in order to meet the expectations of others. The thought gave her an unexpected moment of connection to this powerful man, this prince who seemed to have everything while she had nothing, and she almost laughed at the absurdity of it. What could a prince possibly have in common with a peasant girl wearing her dead mother's dress? Yet the recognition was there, undeniable, a shared understanding of what it meant to wear a mask for the benefit of those watching. Prince Theodore continued his progress through the great hall, and Isadora watched him with a fascination she could not quite explain. There was something magnetic about the way he moved, the way he commanded the space around him without seeming to try. Every person he spoke to appeared to feel as though they were the only one in the room, receiving his full attention for those brief moments before he moved on to the next courtier seeking his favor. Isadora decided it was time to sample some of the food while she had the chance, before her nerve failed entirely and she fled back to the safety of obscurity. She moved along the wall toward one of the laden tables, keeping her movements small and unobtrusive, hoping to avoid drawing any attention to herself. The food was even more magnificent up close than it had appeared from a distance. There were roasted pheasants with crispy golden skin, their bodies stuffed with herbs and fruits she could not name. Platters of venison glistened with rich sauces, and fresh bread still warm from the ovens released clouds of steam when broken open. There were delicacies she had only heard about in stories, candied fruits that sparkled like jewels, and pastries so delicate they looked as though they might dissolve at a touch. She reached for a small piece of bread, her hand trembling slightly with hunger and nerves, when a voice beside her made her jump. "The honey cakes are particularly good, I'm told, though I confess I have not yet had the courage to try one myself." Isadora turned to find an older woman standing beside her, a lady of perhaps 50 years whose kind face was framed by silver-streaked hair, arranged in an elegant style beneath a simple circlet of gold. Her gown was deep burgundy wool trimmed with ermine, marking her as nobility of some rank, and she wore a necklace of garnets that caught the candlelight with every breath. "I'm sorry, my lady," Isadora stammered, suddenly terrified that she had committed some breach of etiquette by approaching the food table. "I did not mean to presume." The older woman laughed, a warm sound that eased some of Isadora's tension. "Presume, my dear girl. The food is here to be eaten, and you look as though you could use some nourishment. I am Lady Beatrice, wife to the Earl of Northmoor, and I have been attending these tedious affairs for more years than I care to count. Please, help yourself to whatever you like, and do not let the disapproving stares of these peacocks intimidate you." Isadora glanced around and realized that several nobles were indeed watching her, with expressions that ranged from curious to disdainful, clearly marking her as someone who did not quite belong in their elevated company. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, the familiar shame of poverty threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Lady Beatrice seemed to sense her discomfort and moved closer, speaking in a lower voice meant only for Isadora's ears. "Pay them no mind, child. Half of these so-called nobles have family trees with branches that would not bear close examination, and the other half are drowning in debts they can never repay. At least you have the courage to be here, which is more than can be said for many who hide behind their titles and pretend the common folk do not exist." "You are very kind, my lady," Isadora said softly, managing a small smile despite her anxiety. "I confess I feel rather out of my depth." "As well you should. This world of ours is designed to make people feel exactly that way, to keep everyone in their proper place and prevent too much mixing between the classes. But Prince Theodore has other ideas, it seems, and I for one applaud his initiative, even if it does make the more conservative members of court uncomfortable." Isadora's curiosity overcame her nervousness for a moment. "You speak of the prince as if you know him well, my lady. What manner of man is he truly, beyond the public face he shows to his subjects?" Lady Beatrice's expression grew thoughtful, and she glanced across the hall to where Prince Theodore was now engaged in conversation with a group of visiting dignitaries, his posture perfect and his attention seemingly complete, though Isadora noticed the way his eyes occasionally flickered toward the windows, as if seeking escape. "Theodore is a complex man," Lady Beatrice said after a moment's consideration. "He was raised to be king, groomed from birth for the responsibility of ruling a kingdom, and that weight sits heavy on his shoulders. His father, King Edmund, is a hard man, demanding and often cruel, with little patience for what he sees as weakness or sentiment. Theodore learned early that showing emotion was dangerous, that vulnerability could be exploited, and so he built walls around himself that few have ever managed to breach. The older woman paused, selecting a honey cake from the table and examining it as if it held great significance. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior, I believe there is a man who genuinely cares about his people, who sees the suffering caused by the current system and wishes to change it. This ball, for instance, was entirely his idea, and he fought his father for months to make it happen. The king finally agreed only because he thought it would make Theodore look foolish, thought the common folk would embarrass themselves and prove why the classes should remain separate. I suspect His Majesty will be disappointed on that front. Before Isidora could respond, a sudden commotion drew their attention back to the center of the hall. A young woman had apparently stumbled while dancing, her foot catching in the hem of her elaborate gown, and she had fallen directly into the path of Prince Theodore, who caught her reflexively to prevent her from hitting the floor. The woman, clearly mortified, began apologizing profusely, her face flushed with embarrassment, while the nobles around them tried unsuccessfully to hide their amusement at her clumsiness. But it was Prince Theodore's reaction that caused the real stir. Instead of helping the woman to her feet with cold courtesy and then dismissing her as an annoyance, he threw back his head and laughed, a genuine sound of mirth that seemed to surprise even him. He helped her stand with exaggerated gallantry, bowing as if she were a great lady rather than a minor noblewoman who had just made a fool of herself, and the warmth in his eyes as he assured her that no harm was done seemed completely sincere. "You see," Lady Beatrice murmured beside Isidora, "there is kindness in him, though he tries to hide it behind the mask of princely dignity. His father would have been coldly dismissive, would have made that poor girl feel her humiliation even more keenly, but Theodore chooses compassion instead." Isidora found herself warming to this unknown prince, this man who seemed trapped by his position just as surely as she was trapped by her poverty, though their cages were very different in nature. She wondered what it would be like to speak with him, to see if the person Lady Beatrice described was truly there beneath the royal facade, but such thoughts were foolish fantasy. Princes did not converse with peasant girls, no matter how fine the dress they wore. The evening progressed, and Isidora gradually relaxed enough to sample some of the food, each bite a revelation of flavors she had never experienced. The honey cake Lady Beatrice had recommended was indeed delicious, sweet, and rich, with a complexity that made her close her eyes in appreciation. She tried to eat slowly, to savor each morsel, but her empty stomach demanded satisfaction, and she found herself consuming more than was probably proper for a lady. Lady Beatrice had moved on to speak with other acquaintances, but she had introduced Isidora to several people as a friend from the country, a vague description that seemed to satisfy the curious without raising too many questions. Isidora found herself engaged in conversations about topics she knew nothing about, nodding and smiling and offering non-committal responses that seemed to pass for wit among these nobles who were more interested in hearing themselves talk than in actually listening to others. As the musicians struck up a new melody, couples began forming for another dance, and Isidora retreated back to her position against the wall, content to observe rather than risk exposing her complete ignorance of formal dancing. She watched the nobles move through their elaborate steps, the ladies' gowns swirling like flower petals caught in a gentle wind, the gentlemen guiding their partners with practiced ease. It was while she was thus occupied, her attention fixed on the dancers, that disaster struck. A servant carrying a large tray of wine goblets passed too close to where Isidora stood, and another guest, stepping backward without looking, collided with the servant. The tray tilted, and before anyone could react, red wine splashed across Isidora's emerald dress, soaking the silk and staining it a dark, ugly color that spread like blood across the fabric. Isidora gasped, looking down at the ruined gown in horror. The servant was apologizing frantically, trying to dab at the stain with a cloth that only seemed to spread it further, and several nobles had turned to stare at the commotion, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to coldly amused. Isidora felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, tears of humiliation and despair, because this dress had been her mother's most precious possession, the one beautiful thing Margaret had kept from her old life, and now it was destroyed. "It's ruined," Isadora whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "It's completely ruined." The servant continued apologizing, looking nearly as distressed as Isadora felt, and she tried to assure him that it was not his fault, that accidents happened, but the words came out choked and barely coherent. She needed to leave, needed to escape this place before she broke down completely in front of all these strangers. But her feet seemed rooted to the floor, refusing to obey her desperate desire to flee. And then, cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers and the servant's continued apologies, came a voice that commanded instant silence. "What has happened here?" Isadora looked up through a blur of unshed tears to find Prince Theodore standing before her, his tall frame blocking out the rest of the hall, his storm-cloud eyes fixed on her ruined dress with an expression she could not quite read. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had seemed from a distance, his presence filling the space around him with an almost physical force, and Isadora found herself unable to speak, unable to do anything but stare at him like a startled deer facing a hunter. The servant stammered out an explanation, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to make clear that the accident had not been intentional, that he had been jostled and lost control of the tray. Prince Theodore listened without interrupting, his gaze never leaving Isadora's face, and she felt as though those penetrating eyes were seeing straight through her careful disguise to the desperate peasant girl beneath. When the servant finished speaking, Prince Theodore turned his attention fully to Isadora, and the intensity of his focus made her breath catch in her throat. "And you, my lady," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only those immediately around them could hear. "Are you injured? Wine stains can be addressed, but if you have been hurt, that is a matter of greater concern." "I am unharmed, your highness," Isadora managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Merely distressed at the damage to my gown." Prince Theodore's eyes flickered down to the stained dress, and something changed in his expression, a slight tightening around his mouth that might have been sympathy, or might have been something else entirely. "The gown appears to be quite old," he observed, and Isadora's heart sank, certain that he had seen through her pretense, that he knew she was wearing a borrowed dress from a bygone era, which makes it all the more valuable, I should think. Heirlooms carry significance beyond mere fashion. He understood, Isadora realized with a shock. Somehow, without her saying a word, Prince Theodore had grasped that this dress meant something to her, that it was not simply clothing but something precious and irreplaceable. The recognition in his eyes was unmistakable, and for a brief moment, the mask he wore for the court slipped, revealing a man who knew what it meant to treasure small things in a world that valued grandeur and display. "Your Highness is most perceptive," Isadora said carefully, not trusting herself to say more without her voice breaking entirely. Prince Theodore seemed about to respond when another voice cut through the moment, sharp and mocking, shattering the fragile connection that had formed between them. My, what have we here? A peasant in silk, and poorly fitted silk at that. How delightfully amusing." Isadora turned to see a nobleman she did not recognize, a man of perhaps 30 years with cold gray eyes and thin lips curved in a sneer that spoke of habitual cruelty. His clothing marked him as someone of high rank, with a doublet of fine black velvet and a chain of gold across his chest that proclaimed some office or honor, and the way the other nobles deferred to him suggested power and influence. "Lord Percival," Prince Theodore said, and there was an edge to his voice that had not been there before, a warning that the newcomer either did not hear or chose to ignore. "I do not believe your commentary was requested." Lord Percival laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor. "Come now, Theodore, surely even you can see the absurdity of this situation. This girl stands before us wearing a dress that went out of fashion 20 years ago, clearly altered to fit her, and stained with wine because she lacks the grace to avoid servants. She is obviously one of the common folk you insisted on inviting, trying desperately to appear as something she is not. It is rather pathetic, when one thinks about it." The words hung in the air like poison, and Isadora felt the blood drain from her face, as every eye in the immediate vicinity turned toward her. The whispers began almost immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire, and she could hear the speculation in the voices of those around her, the cruel amusement at her exposure. Lord Percival's sneer deepened, clearly pleased with the reaction his words had provoked, and he looked at Prince Theodore as if expecting him to join in the mockery. But Prince Theodore did not laugh. Instead, his expression hardened into something cold and dangerous, a look that made even Lord Percival's smugness falter slightly. The prince took a step forward, positioning himself between Isidora and the mocking nobleman, his broad shoulders blocking her from the worst of the stares. And when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that silenced the whispers instantly. "Lord Percival, I will say this once, and I suggest you listen carefully. This young lady is a guest in my home, invited here by my personal decree, and she will be treated with the same respect and courtesy afforded to any other attendee. If you find her presence offensive, you are welcome to remove yourself from the festivities immediately. I assure you, your absence will not be mourned." Lord Percival's face flushed red, whether from anger or embarrassment, Isidora could not tell. "Your Highness, I meant no disrespect to you. I merely thought to point out the obvious, that this girl is clearly not of our class, and her presence here is something of a spectacle." "The only spectacle I see," Prince Theodore replied, his voice as sharp as a blade, "is a nobleman so insecure in his own position that he must attack a young woman who has done nothing to deserve his scorn. The purpose of this ball was to bridge the divide between the nobility and the common folk, to foster understanding and unity. If you cannot embrace that vision, then perhaps you should reconsider whether you belong here at all." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the great hearth and the distant sound of wind against the castle walls. Every person in the hall seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how Lord Percival would respond to this very public rebuke from the Crown Prince. For a long moment, the nobleman simply stood there, his jaw working as if he wanted to say something but could not quite find the words. Finally, with a stiff bow that barely qualified as respectful, Lord Percival turned and stalked away, his posture rigid with suppressed fury. Several other nobles who had been watching with obvious enjoyment suddenly found themselves very interested in other conversations, and the general buzz of the ball slowly resumed, though Isidora could feel the weight of curious stares still fixed on her. Prince Theodore turned back to face her, and the coldness in his expression melted away, replaced by something that looked almost like apology. "I am sorry you had to endure that," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Lord Percival is a bitter man who takes pleasure in the discomfort of others. His words reflect his character, not your worth." Isidora found herself unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the fact that a prince had just defended her honor against a nobleman, something so far outside the realm of her experience that she could barely process it. When she finally found her voice, it came out shaky and uncertain. "Your Highness is too kind." Lord Percival spoke only the truth. "I am indeed common-born, and I have no right to be here among your guests." "You have every right," Prince Theodore said firmly. "I extended the invitation to all people of this realm, regardless of birth or station, and I meant it. The fact that some choose to mock my sincerity speaks to their limitations, not yours." He paused, studying her face with those penetrating storm cloud eyes, and Isidora felt as though he could see every secret she had ever kept, every fear and hope and desperate dream. "What is your name?" "Isidora, your Highness," she answered, dropping into a curtsy that she hoped was proper, though she had never actually performed one before and could only imitate what she had observed from the other ladies. "Isidora," he repeated as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. "A beautiful name, from the Greek, meaning gift of the goddess. Are you a gift, I wonder, sent to remind me why I fought so hard to make this evening happen?" The question was so unexpected, so intimate in its implication, that Isidora felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am no one's gift, your Highness, merely a girl who accepted an invitation she perhaps should have declined. And yet you came, despite knowing you would face judgment and scorn from those who believe themselves your betters." "That takes courage, Isidora. More courage than many of the nobles in this hall possess." Prince Theodore extended his hand to her, palm up, in a gesture that could only mean one thing. "Would you honor me with a dance? I promise to be gentle with your ruined gown, and perhaps we can show these narrow-minded fools that grace and dignity have nothing to do with the circumstances of one's birth." Isidora stared at his outstretched hand, as if it were a serpent that might strike at any moment. To dance with the prince, to accept such a public display of favor, would mark her permanently in the eyes of everyone present. Some would see it as evidence of Prince Theodore's genuine commitment to equality, while others, like Lord Percival, would view it as confirmation that the prince was a fool who did not understand the proper order of things. Either way, she would become the subject of gossip and speculation, and the attention terrified her. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a spark of defiance that had been growing since the moment Prince Theodore had defended her against Lord Percival's mockery. These nobles, with their fine clothes and their inherited titles, looked down on her because of where she had been born, because her mother had loved unwisely and paid the price for it. They judged her without knowing anything about her life, her struggles, the sacrifices she had made to care for her dying mother. Why should she cower before their disdain? Why should she accept their verdict that she was less than them? "I must warn your highness," Isidora said, placing her hand in his and feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. "I have never learned the formal dances of the court. I will likely step on your feet and make both of us look foolish." Prince Theodore smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had seen on his face all evening, transforming his stern features into something almost boyish. "Then we shall be foolish together, and I cannot think of better company for such an endeavor." He led her onto the floor, and the other dancers parted to make room, their expressions ranging from shock to disapproval to barely concealed delight at this unexpected development. The musicians, sensing the importance of the moment, began a new piece, something slower and more forgiving than the complex dances that had come before, and Prince Theodore positioned himself opposite Isidora, his right hand finding her waist while his left hand held hers aloft. "Follow my lead," he murmured, "and do not worry about the steps. Dancing is merely walking to music, and I suspect you know how to walk." They began to move, and Isidora discovered that Prince Theodore was as good as his word, guiding her through the movements with such skill that her inexperience was barely noticeable. When she did stumble, he compensated smoothly, making it seem as though the misstep had been intentional, part of the dance rather than evidence of her lack of training. Around them, other couples joined the dance, and soon the floor was full of swirling gowns and measured steps. But Isidora was aware only of the man before her, of the way his eyes never left her face, studying her with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and strangely safe. "You are managing far better than you claimed," Prince Theodore observed, after they had completed several turns around the floor without incident. "Either you are a natural dancer, or you are more experienced than you let on." "Neither, your highness. I simply have a good teacher." Isidora surprised herself with the boldness of the response, but Prince Theodore's smile widened, and she felt a flutter of something warm and dangerous in her chest, an emotion she did not dare name. "Tell me about yourself, Isidora," the prince said as they continued to dance, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Where do you come from? What brings you to Ravencrest on this cold winter evening?" Isidora hesitated, torn between the desire to be honest with this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness and the fear of revealing too much, of exposing the desperate circumstances that had driven her to attend the ball. In the end, she settled for a version of the truth that omitted the most painful details. "I come from Thornwick, your highness, a small village to the north. My mother is ill, very ill, and I came tonight because she wished it. She wanted me to experience something beyond our cottage walls, to see how the other half lives, as she put it." Prince Theodore's expression grew serious, and his hand tightened slightly on her waist, a gesture that might have been comfort, or might have been simple acknowledgement of her words. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman to want better things for her daughter. Is she alone while you are here?" "Yes, your highness, and I worry for her constantly. I should not have come, should not have left her for so long, but she insisted, and I could not deny her this one request." Isidora blinked back tears that threatened to spill, overwhelmed by the guilt she had been carrying since leaving Thornwick that morning. "Then we must make certain your attendance was worthwhile, that you have stories to tell her that will make her smile despite her illness." Prince Theodore was quiet for a moment, as if considering his next words carefully. "The dress you wear, the one now stained with wine, it holds significance for you beyond its monetary value. I saw that in your eyes when you looked at the damage. May I ask its history?" Isidora took a deep breath, steadying herself before answering. "It belonged to my mother, from her youth. She wore it only once, she told me, and then put it away, unable to bear looking at it because it reminded her of everything she had lost. She gave it to me for this evening, altered it so that I might have something fine to wear, and now I have ruined it through my own carelessness." "You did not ruin it," Prince Theodore corrected gently. An accident occurred, one that could have happened to anyone, noble or common. The stain can likely be removed by skilled hands, and even if it cannot, the dress has served its purpose. It brought you here tonight, allowed you to experience this world, and that is worth more than any amount of wine damage. They continued to dance, and gradually Isadora became aware that other conversations in the hall had quieted, that many of the guests were watching the prince dance with the peasant girl in the stained dress, their expressions revealing the scandal of the moment. Lady Beatrice caught her eye from across the room and nodded approvingly, a small gesture of support that gave Isadora courage, while Lord Percival glowered from a corner, his displeasure evident in every line of his rigid posture. "They are staring at us," Isadora whispered, suddenly conscious of the attention in a way she had not been while focused solely on Prince Theodore. "Let them stare," the prince replied, his voice carrying an edge of defiance that surprised her. "Let them see that I meant what I said when I opened this ball to all people. Let them understand that the future of this kingdom will not be built on maintaining the divisions of the past, but on finding common ground between all who call England home." The music swelled to its conclusion, and Prince Theodore brought them to a graceful stop, bowing to Isadora with the same courtesy he would have shown to the highest-ranking lady in the realm. The hall erupted in polite applause, the sound echoing off the stone walls, and Isadora curtsied in return, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. "Thank you for the dance, Isadora," Prince Theodore said, taking her hand and raising it to his lips in a gesture that sent whispers racing through the assembled nobles. "You have given me hope that this evening might actually achieve what I intended, that perhaps understanding between the classes is not the impossible dream my critics claim it to be." Before Isadora could respond, a servant approached and whispered something in the prince's ear, and his expression shifted, the public mask sliding back into place as duty called him away. He excused himself with obvious reluctance, leaving Isadora standing alone in the center of the dance floor, the focus of countless stares and the subject of conversations that buzzed around her like angry wasps. Lady Beatrice materialized at her elbow, linking arms with Isadora in a gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by those watching. "That was quite a performance, my dear," the older woman said with approval. "The prince has not danced with anyone tonight until now, and he chose you, a stranger in a stained dress, over all the eligible noble women who have been throwing themselves at him since the moment he entered the hall. You have made quite an impression." "I fear I have made the wrong kind of impression," Isadora replied quietly, watching Prince Theodore disappear into the crowd, his dark head visible for a moment before being swallowed by the press of bodies. "Lord Percival and others like him will see this as evidence that the prince is unfit to rule, that he cannot distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate behavior. Lord Percival is a fool whose opinion matters far less than he believes," Lady Beatrice said dismissively. "Pay him no mind, child. The prince knows his own heart, and if he chose to dance with you, it was because he saw something in you worth his attention. That is a rare gift, and you should treasure it, not question it." The evening continued, and Isadora found herself approached by several other guests, some out of genuine curiosity, and others clearly hoping to curry favor with the prince by befriending the girl he had singled out. She navigated these conversations as best she could, trying to answer questions without revealing too much about her true circumstances, and all the while she searched the crowd for another glimpse of Prince Theodore, though she told herself such searching was foolish and could only lead to disappointment. It was nearly midnight when she finally accepted that she needed to leave, to begin the long walk back to Thornwick before exhaustion overtook her completely. She slipped away from the great hall, making her way back to the gardener's shed where she had hidden her peasant clothes, ready to shed the silk dress and the pretense of belonging in that glittering world. But as she reached for the door handle, a voice from the shadows made her freeze. "Leaving so soon, Isadora? I had hoped we might have another dance before the evening ended." Isadora's heart leaped into her throat as Prince Theodore stepped out of the shadows, his tall frame backlit by torches that flickered in the cold night air. He had removed his heavy fur cloak and now wore only the midnight blue doublet, which made him look somehow more approachable, less the untouchable prince and more simply a man. His dark hair had become slightly disheveled from the warmth of the crowded hall, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen before, a vulnerability that made her breath catch. "Your Highness," she stammered, dropping into a hasty curtsy that nearly sent her stumbling on the uneven cobblestones of the courtyard. I did not expect to see you out here. I thought you would be occupied with your guests. I have been occupied with my guests for hours, performing my duty as host and future king, smiling until my face aches, and making conversation with people who care nothing for me, beyond what advantages my favor might bring them. Prince Theodore moved closer, and Isadora could see the weariness etched into the lines around his eyes, the strain of maintaining his princely facade for so long. When I saw you slip away from the hall, I found myself compelled to follow, though I could not have explained why, even if you demanded it of me. I should not have left without bidding you farewell, Isadora said, acutely aware of the impropriety of being alone with the prince in the darkness, away from the watchful eyes of the court. It was rude of me, after your kindness in defending me against Lord Percival and honoring me with a dance. Prince Theodore waved away her apology with one hand, his storm-cloud eyes never leaving her face. You owe me no explanations, Isadora. You came to the ball as I invited all my subjects to do. You experienced what our world has to offer, and now you wish to return home. That is your right, and I would not presume to question it. But I find myself curious about something, and I hope you will indulge my impertinence. Of course, Your Highness. Ask me anything you wish. Why did you come tonight? The question was simple, but the intensity with which Prince Theodore asked it suggested layers of meaning beneath the surface. You knew you would face judgment and scorn from the nobility. You knew your dress, beautiful though it is, would mark you as someone from an earlier generation, someone out of step with current fashion. You knew, in short, that attending this ball would bring you more pain than pleasure, and yet you came anyway. I want to understand what could drive someone to accept such certain suffering. Isadora considered lying, offering some pleasant fiction that would satisfy his curiosity without exposing the raw truth of her desperation. But something about the way Prince Theodore looked at her, as if he genuinely cared about her answer, as if her words mattered to him in ways that transcended the vast gulf between their stations, made deception impossible. She found herself speaking the truth, the whole truth, letting the words spill out before she could reconsider. My mother is dying, Your Highness. She has been ill for months now, wasting away despite everything I have tried to do to save her. We have no money for proper medicine, no means to pay a physician who might ease her suffering. Each day I watch her slip a little further from me, and I am powerless to stop it. Isadora's voice broke, and she had to pause to compose herself before continuing. When your messenger announced the ball, my mother insisted that I attend. She gave me this dress, the one thing of value she has kept from her youth, and she told me that I deserved one night to see beyond our cottage walls, to experience something beautiful before her death takes that possibility away forever. I came tonight not for myself, Your Highness, but for her, so that I might have stories to tell in her final days, memories to share that might bring her some small measure of joy. The silence that followed her confession seemed to stretch for an eternity. Prince Theodore stood motionless, his expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight, and Isadora wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in revealing so much to this powerful man who had no reason to care about the suffering of one peasant woman and her daughter. But then he moved, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides, and before Isadora could react, he had taken both her hands in his, holding them with a gentleness that contrasted starkly with his obvious strength. I am sorry, Prince Theodore said, and the emotion in his voice was unmistakable, raw and genuine in a way that his carefully modulated princely tones had not been. I am sorry that you and your mother have been forced to endure such hardship, and I am sorry that the systems meant to protect and care for all people of this realm have failed you so completely. This is precisely why I fought for this ball, why I insisted on opening it to everyone regardless of birth or wealth. I wanted to see the faces of those who suffer under the current order, to understand their struggles in a way that reports and statistics can never convey. You have given me that understanding, Isadora, and I will not forget it. Isadora felt tears spilling down her cheeks, unable to contain them any longer. Your Highness is kind to say such things, but kindness does not change reality. My mother will still die, and I will still be alone in the world, with nothing but memories of this one strange night when a prince treated me as though I mattered. You do matter, Prince Theodore insisted, his grip on her hands tightening as if he could anchor her to the truth of his words through physical contact alone. Every person in this kingdom matters, from the highest noble to the lowest beggar, and a ruler who forgets that is unworthy of his crown. I cannot save your mother, Isadora, though I wish with all my heart that I could, but I can ensure that her final days are more comfortable, that she has access to medicines and physicians who might ease her pain if not cure her illness. Your Highness, I could never accept such charity, Isadora protested, even as hope flared painful and bright in her chest. You have already shown me more kindness than I have any right to expect. It is not charity, Prince Theodore said firmly. It is what should have been available to your mother from the beginning, what will be available to all who need it if I have any say in shaping the future of this kingdom. Please, Isadora, allow me to do this. Allow me to help. Not because you are obligated to accept, but because I am asking you to give me the chance to be more than a privileged prince who knows nothing of real suffering. Isadora looked into his eyes and saw something there that took her breath away. A desperate sincerity that spoke of a man who carried burdens she could only imagine, who wanted to make a difference but felt constrained by the weight of tradition and expectation. In that moment, she understood that Prince Theodore was just as trapped as she was, albeit in a very different kind of cage, and the recognition created a bond between them that transcended the accidents of their births. If your Highness insists, then I will accept with gratitude, Isadora said softly. But I fear what others will say, how they will interpret your generosity. Lord Percival and his ilk will use this as ammunition against you, will claim that you are being manipulated by a peasant girl who has bewitched you with false tears and pretty lies. Prince Theodore laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. Let them say what they will. I have lived my entire life worrying about the opinions of men like Lord Percival, and it has brought me nothing but frustration and constraint. For once, I want to act according to my own conscience rather than the dictates of political expediency. If that makes me a fool in the eyes of the court, so be it. Before Isadora could respond, the sound of footsteps on the cobblestones made them both turn. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Isadora's stomach clenched when she recognized Lord Percival. His thin face twisted into an expression of triumph that sent chills down her spine. He was not alone. Behind him came two other nobles whose names Isadora did not know but whose expressions of cold calculation made her deeply uneasy. How touching, Lord Percival drawled, his voice dripping with false sweetness. The crown prince, alone in the darkness with a peasant girl, holding her hands as though she were his equal. One might almost think there was some impropriety occurring, though surely His Royal Highness would never be so foolish as to compromise himself in such a manner. Prince Theodore released Isadora's hands and turned to face Lord Percival, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant from vulnerable man to commanding royal. You overstep yourself, Percival. I am engaged in a private conversation with one of my guests, and your intrusion is both unwelcome and inappropriate. Private conversations between royalty and commoners rarely remain private for long, Your Highness, Lord Percival replied, moving closer with the two nobles flanking him like trained hounds. Especially when those conversations take place in secluded locations, away from the protection of propriety and witnesses. People will talk, you understand, and the stories they tell might not reflect well on the crown. Isadora felt ice spreading through her veins as she understood what was happening. This was not a chance encounter. Lord Percival had followed them deliberately, had brought companions to serve as witnesses to what he would undoubtedly portray as a scandalous assignation. The implications were clear and terrifying. If word spread that Prince Theodore had been caught alone with a peasant girl in compromising circumstances, the damage to his reputation could be catastrophic, and Isadora herself would be painted as a scheming seductress who had used her feminine wiles to ensnare the naive prince. There is nothing scandalous occurring here, Prince Theodore said, his voice like steel wrapped in silk. I came upon Miss Isadora as she was preparing to depart, and I wish to thank her personally for attending the ball. That is all, and anyone who suggests otherwise is engaging in malicious fabrication. Lord Percival smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. Of course, Your Highness. I am certain your conversation was entirely innocent. However, others may not be so charitable in their interpretation, particularly given the intense interest you showed in this young woman earlier during your dance. It would be unfortunate if rumors began to circulate suggesting that the Crown Prince has developed an inappropriate attachment to someone so far beneath his station. One of the nobles accompanying Lord Percival stepped forward, a man with graying hair and sharp features that reminded Isadora of a hawk. Perhaps a solution could be arranged, he said smoothly, his eyes fixed on Prince Theodore with calculating intensity. If His Highness were to acknowledge that this encounter was merely a momentary lapse in judgment, brought on by the wine and the unusual circumstances of the evening, we would be happy to ensure that no word of it reaches the king or the wider court. We seek only to protect the crown's dignity, after all. Isidora understood immediately what was being offered, and what it would cost. Lord Percival and his companions wanted Prince Theodore to denounce her, to publicly acknowledge that paying attention to her had been a mistake, a foolish whim that he now regretted. In exchange, they would keep silent about finding them alone together, would not spread rumors that could damage both Theodore's reputation and Isidora's already precarious position. It was blackmail wrapped in the language of concern for the crown, and the cruelty of it made Isidora's hands clench into fists at her sides. "You want me to humiliate this young woman?" Prince Theodore said quietly, his voice dangerous in its calmness. "You want me to stand here and declare that showing her basic human kindness was an error, that treating her with the respect due to any of my subjects was a lapse in judgment? That is what you are asking of me." "We are asking you to remember your duty to the crown," the hawk-faced noble replied. "Personal feelings, however noble they might be, must yield to the greater good of the kingdom. A prince cannot afford to be seen cavorting with peasants, not if he wishes to maintain the authority necessary to rule effectively." For a long moment, Prince Theodore stood perfectly still, and Isidora held her breath, waiting to see what he would choose. She wanted to tell him that it was all right, that she understood if he needed to protect himself, that she had never expected anything different from the world that had treated her with such consistent cruelty. But the words would not come, trapped in her throat by the painful hope that maybe, just maybe, he would choose differently. "No," Prince Theodore said finally, and the single word rang out in the courtyard like a bell. "I will not denounce Isidora, and I will not pretend that treating her with kindness was a mistake. You may spread whatever rumors you wish, Percival. You may run to my father and tell him that his son danced with a peasant girl and spoke with her privately in the courtyard. I do not care. What I will not do is betray my own principles simply to avoid the disapproval of men whose opinions I have never respected." Lord Percival's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of cold fury. "You are making a grave error, Your Highness. The king will not look favorably on this rebellion, and there are those at court who would be happy to see you removed from the succession if you prove yourself unfit to rule. Then let them try." Prince Theodore shot back, his voice rising with barely controlled anger. "I am tired of being told what I can and cannot do, who I can and cannot speak to, as if my entire existence must be choreographed to satisfy the sensibilities of people who care more about appearances than truth. If standing up for what I believe is right costs me the throne, then perhaps I was never meant to be king in the first place." The words hung in the frigid air, shocking in their implications, and even Lord Percival seemed taken aback by the vehemence of Prince Theodore's declaration. Isidora felt her heart hammering against her ribs, overwhelmed by the fact that this powerful man was risking everything, his future and his position, rather than denounce her as his political survival demanded. "You will regret this decision," Lord Percival said finally, gathering his dignity around him like a cloak. "Mark my words, Your Highness. This foolish attachment to a peasant girl will be your undoing. The king will hear of this, and he will not be pleased." "Let him hear," Prince Theodore replied, though Isidora could see the tension in his shoulders, the acknowledgement of the danger he had just courted. "I am done hiding who I am, and what I believe to appease men who mistake cruelty for strength." Lord Percival and his companions departed without another word, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones as they retreated back toward the great hall. When they were gone, Prince Theodore turned back to Isidora, and she saw exhaustion and determination warring in his expression, along with something else she could not quite name. "I have likely just created significant problems for both of us," the prince said with a rueful smile that did not reach his eyes. "My father will be furious when he hears about this, and Lord Percival will ensure that every noble in England knows that I defied convention to defend a peasant girl. You may find yourself the subject of gossip and speculation, Isidora, and I am sorry for that." Isidora shook her head, finding her voice despite the tumult of emotions swirling within her chest. "Your Highness should not apologize to me. You have given me more tonight than I ever dreamed possible, defending me when you had no obligation to do so, treating me as though I were someone worthy of your time and attention. If there are consequences for that kindness, They fall on me alone, not on you. That is where you are wrong, Prince Theodore said, moving closer until barely a foot separated them. Any consequences that arise from tonight will affect us both, and I will not allow you to shoulder that burden alone. I meant what I said to Percival. I will arrange for physicians to attend to your mother, to provide whatever medicines and care she needs, and I will ensure that you have the means to support yourself, so that you are not left destitute when she passes. Your Highness, I cannot accept such generosity. People will say exactly what Lord Percival suggested, that I have manipulated you somehow, used feminine wiles to extract favors that I do not deserve. Isidora's voice trembled with the conflict between desperate need and stubborn pride, between wanting to accept help and fearing what accepting it would mean. Prince Theodore reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers warm against her cold skin, and the intimacy of the gesture made Isidora's breath catch in her throat. Let them say what they will. I have spent my entire life being told what I should do, how I should behave, who I should care about, and who I should ignore. For once I want to follow my own heart, to act according to my own sense of right and wrong rather than the dictates of political calculation. You need help, Isidora, and I have the power to provide it. That should be the only consideration that matters. Why? The question escaped before Isidora could stop it, raw and desperate. Why do you care what happens to me? You do not know me, have no reason to concern yourself with the fate of one peasant girl among thousands who struggle in poverty throughout your kingdom. What makes me different? What makes me worthy of such extraordinary attention? Prince Theodore was silent for a long moment, his hand still resting against her cheek, his storm cloud eyes searching her face, as if looking for an answer he could not quite articulate. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, intimate and vulnerable in a way that sent shivers down Isidora's spine. I do not know, he admitted. From the moment I saw you standing in the great hall, trying to make yourself invisible against the wall while wearing that beautiful dress with its wine stains spreading like a wound across the silk, I felt something shift inside me. You looked so brave and so terrified at the same time, so determined to endure despite knowing you did not truly belong in that world. I recognized something of myself in you, Isidora. The feeling of being trapped by circumstances beyond your control, of wearing a mask to hide who you truly are from those who would judge you for it. Isidora felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the honesty of his words and the impossibility of what seemed to be growing between them. We are from different worlds, Your Highness. You are a prince, heir to the throne of England, destined to rule a kingdom and shape the future of countless lives. I am a peasant girl from a tiny village, with no education, no prospects, and no future beyond surviving each day as it comes. Whatever you think you see in me, it is an illusion created by candlelight and fine clothes. In the harsh light of day, I am nothing but what I have always been. You are wrong, Prince Theodore said fiercely, his other hand coming up to frame her face, holding her gently but firmly so that she could not look away from the intensity in his eyes. You are brave and compassionate and stronger than any of the pampered nobles who fill my court. You walked for hours in freezing cold to attend a ball where you knew you would be scorned, all because your dying mother wished it. You endured humiliation and mockery with dignity, never lashing out or breaking down, even when you had every right to do so. Those qualities have nothing to do with birth or station, Isidora. They are the measure of who you truly are, and they are more valuable than all the noble blood and inherited titles in England. Before Isidora could respond, before she could even process the implications of what Prince Theodore was saying, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both gentle and desperate, as if he were trying to convey everything he could not put into words through that single point of contact. For a heartbeat, Isidora froze, shocked by the boldness of his action and the impossibility of a prince kissing a peasant girl in a darkened courtyard where anyone might see them. But then something inside her melted, and she found herself kissing him back, her hands coming up to clutch at the fine fabric of his doublet, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unmoored from reality. The kiss deepened, and Isidora tasted wine on his lips, felt the warmth of his breath mingling with hers, and for one perfect moment, nothing else existed beyond the two of them, and the connection that had formed between them against all logic and reason. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Prince Theodore rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face as if she were something precious and fragile that might shatter if handled roughly. "I should not have done that," he whispered, though his tone suggested he did not truly regret it. "I have compromised you beyond repair, given Lord Percival and his cronies exactly the scandal they were hoping for if anyone witnessed what just occurred." "No one saw," Isidora said, though she could not be certain of that claim. The courtyard appeared empty, but shadows could hide many things, and she had learned long ago that privacy was a luxury rarely afforded to those without power. "And even if they did, Your Highness, I do not regret it. For one moment I felt as though I mattered to someone, as though I were more than just a burden to be endured or a problem to be solved. That gift is worth whatever price I may have to pay for it." Prince Theodore pulled back slightly, his hands dropping from her face to take her hands once more, lacing his fingers through hers in a gesture that felt both natural and impossibly intimate. "I want to see you again," he said, the words tumbling out as if he could not hold them back. "I know that is selfish and dangerous and probably impossible, but I cannot bear the thought of tonight being our only time together. Will you come back to Ravencrest?" "Please, Isidora, say you will find a way to return." Isidora wanted to say yes, wanted it so badly that the desire frightened her with its intensity, but reality intruded, cold and unyielding as the winter wind that whistled through the courtyard. "Your Highness, I live a full day's walk from here, and my mother cannot be left alone for long periods. Even if I wanted to return, the practicalities make it nearly impossible." "Then I will come to you," Prince Theodore declared, his voice taking on the commanding tone of someone used to having his decisions become reality through sheer force of will. "I will ride to Thornwick, see your mother for myself, ensure that the physicians I send are providing adequate care. It will give me an excuse to leave the castle, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of court for a few hours." "Your Highness, if you appear in Thornwick, the entire village will know within minutes, and the gossip will reach the court before you even return to Ravencrest," Isidora protested, even as hope flared bright and painful in her chest. "You will create exactly the scandal you claim to wish to avoid." Prince Theodore smiled, and there was something reckless in his expression, a willingness to throw caution to the wind that both excited and terrified Isidora. "I am the Crown Prince of England. If I wish to ride through my own kingdom and check on the welfare of my subjects, who is to tell me I cannot? Let the gossips whisper. I am done living my life according to their narrow expectations." Before Isidora could argue further, the sound of voices from within the castle signaled that other guests were beginning to depart, the ball drawing to a close as the hour grew late. Prince Theodore reluctantly released her hands, stepping back to put a proper distance between them, though his eyes remained fixed on her face with an intensity that made Isidora feel as though she were the only person in the world who mattered to him. "You should go," he said quietly. "The road back to Thornwick is long, and you need to reach your mother before daylight. But know this, Isidora. Tonight changed something in me, opened my eyes to possibilities I had never considered before. Whatever happens, whatever obstacles we face, I will not forget you, or the courage you showed in coming here despite knowing how you would be received." Isidora nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice breaking. She turned toward the shed where her peasant clothes waited, then paused and looked back at the prince one last time. "Thank you, Your Highness, for everything. For defending me against Lord Percival. For the dance. For seeing me as more than just another faceless peasant. I will carry the memory of this night with me always, no matter what the future holds." She did not wait for his response, could not bear to see the expression in his eyes as she walked away, retreating into the shed to change back into her worn clothing and shed the identity of a lady that had never truly fit her anyway. As she removed the stained silk dress and folded it carefully, she noticed that her hands were shaking. Whether from cold or emotion she could not tell. The walk back to Thornwick was even more difficult than the journey to Ravencrest had been, partly because exhaustion dragged at Isidora's limbs with every step, and partly because her mind would not stop replaying the events of the evening, turning over each moment like precious stones to be examined from every angle. Prince Theodore's kiss burned on her lips, a phantom sensation that would not fade, and his words echoed in her head, promising things that logic insisted were impossible. Dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, by the time Isidora finally stumbled through the door of the cottage. Margaret was awake, propped up on pillows with her thin face turned toward the door as if she had been waiting for her daughter's return. and the smile that lit her features when she saw Isadora made the long night of walking worthwhile. "Tell me everything," Margaret said, her voice weak but eager. "I want to hear about the ball, about the nobles in their fine clothes, about the prince himself. Did you dance? Did you eat the wonderful food? Did you see things that made you understand why I wanted you to go?" Isadora settled onto the edge of the bed, taking her mother's frail hand in both of hers, and began to speak. She told Margaret about the great hall with its hundreds of candles, about the music and the dancers and the tables laden with food that seemed to come from some fairy tale, rather than reality. She described Lady Beatrice's kindness and Lord Percival's cruelty, the wine stain on the dress and Prince Theodore's unexpected defense of her honor. But she did not mention the conversation in the courtyard, the kiss that had turned her world upside down, or the prince's promise to come to Thornwick. Some things were too precious and too fragile to share, even with the person she loved most in the world, and Isadora feared that speaking the words aloud might somehow break the spell, might reveal the entire evening to have been nothing more than an elaborate dream from which she would wake to find herself back in the harsh reality of her everyday existence. Margaret listened with rapt attention, her eyes shining with tears of joy at hearing her daughter describe experiences so far removed from their daily struggle for survival. When Isadora finished speaking, the older woman squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "I am so glad you went," Margaret whispered. "So glad you had this one night to see beyond these walls, to understand that there is beauty in the world, even if we cannot always reach it. Thank you, my darling girl, for giving me this gift, these stories that I can hold close as I prepare for my final journey." "Do not speak of final journeys yet, Mother," Isadora said, though they both knew the truth of Margaret's condition. "You still have time, and I intend to make the most of every moment we have left together." The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion and routine, with Isadora tending to her mother and trying to put the ball out of her mind, to accept that it had been a singular event never to be repeated. But 3 days after her return from Ravencrest, a commotion in the village square drew her out of the cottage to investigate, and what she saw made her heart stop in her chest. A group of riders had entered Thornwick, and at their head, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, was Prince Theodore himself. He wore traveling clothes rather than formal court attire, a heavy cloak of dark wool over a leather doublet, but there was no mistaking his identity. The villagers gathered around in shocked silence, unable to comprehend why royalty would visit their humble community, and Isadora stood frozen in the doorway of her cottage, torn between joy at seeing him again and terror at what his presence might mean. Prince Theodore's eyes scanned the crowd until they found Isadora, and the smile that crossed his face was so open and genuine that several of the villagers turned to look at her, trying to understand why the prince's attention had fixed on the poorest girl in Thornwick. He dismounted with fluid grace and began walking toward her, and Isadora's mind raced, trying to think of what she should do, how she should react to this impossible situation. Behind Prince Theodore, Isadora noticed other riders, and her stomach clenched when she recognized one of them as a physician, his profession marked by the leather satchel he carried and the air of learned authority he projected. True to his word, the prince had brought medical help for Margaret, had remembered his promise despite the days that had passed and the many demands that must have occupied his time. "Miss Isadora," Prince Theodore said when he reached her, his voice formal for the benefit of those listening, but his eyes warm with an emotion that made Isadora's pulse race. "I hope you will forgive this intrusion. I was passing through the area on royal business and thought to check on your mother's condition, as we discussed at the ball. I have brought my personal physician to examine her, if you will permit it." The lie was transparent, at least to Isadora. Thornwick was not on the way to anywhere of importance, and princes did not simply pass through peasant villages on a whim. But the fiction allowed them both to maintain propriety, to pretend that this visit was merely an extension of Prince Theodore's stated desire to understand and help his subjects, rather than what it truly was, a powerful man risking scandal and political consequences to see again a woman he could not stop thinking about. "Your Highness is most kind," Isadora said, dropping into a curtsy that felt awkward and out of place in the muddy street outside her cottage. "My mother would be honored to receive your physician's care." The physician, an older man with kind eyes and silver hair, dismounted and retrieved his leather satchel, following Isadora into the cottage while Prince Theodore remained outside, speaking with some of the villagers who had gathered to witness this unprecedented event. Isadora could hear the murmur of voices, the prince asking questions about their lives and the challenges they faced, and she marveled at how genuinely interested he sounded, as if the concerns of these poor farmers and laborers truly mattered to him. Inside the cottage, Margaret's eyes widened with shock when the physician introduced himself as Dr. William Ashford, personal physician to the royal family. "Your Highness sent me to examine you, madam," he said gently, setting his satchel on the small table beside the bed. "If you will permit me, I would like to assess your condition and determine what treatments might ease your suffering." Margaret looked to Isadora with confusion and wonder written across her pale face. The prince himself sent his physician? But why? How does he even know of my existence? "I attended the ball at Ravencrest, mother, as you asked me to do," Isadora explained, keeping her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "His Highness was kind enough to notice my distress when I mentioned your illness, and he offered to send help. I did not think he would actually follow through on such a promise, but it seems Prince Theodore is a man of his word." Dr. Ashford began his examination with practiced efficiency, checking Margaret's pulse, listening to her breathing, examining the pallor of her skin and the sunken quality of her eyes. He asked questions about her symptoms, how long she had been ill, what treatments had been attempted, and Margaret answered as best she could, though exhaustion made her words come slowly. Isadora stood nearby, wringing her hands anxiously, desperate to hear that something could be done, that her mother might be saved from the fate that had seemed so inevitable just days before. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Ashford straightened and turned to Isadora with an expression that was neither entirely hopeful nor completely grim. "Your mother suffers from a wasting sickness that has progressed significantly. I will not lie to you and claim that I can cure her, for the damage to her body is extensive. However, I can provide medicines that will ease her pain, strengthen her enough to give her more time, and improve the quality of her remaining days. With proper care and nourishment, she may yet have months rather than weeks, and those months need not be filled with the agony she has been enduring." Tears of relief streamed down Isadora's face as she grasped the physician's hands in gratitude. "Thank you, Dr. Ashford. Thank you so much. Even a few more months with my mother, months where she is not in constant pain, is more than I dared hope for." The physician smiled kindly and patted her hand. "Prince Theodore was most insistent that I do everything in my power to help. He has authorized me to provide whatever medicines are needed, regardless of cost, and to return weekly to monitor your mother's progress. He has also arranged for food and firewood to be delivered to your cottage regularly, so that you need not worry about basic necessities while caring for her." Margaret, who had been listening to this exchange with tears running down her own cheeks, reached out a trembling hand toward Isadora. "The prince has done all this? For us? For people he does not even know? What manner of man is he?" "A good man, mother," Isadora said softly, squeezing her mother's hand. "A man who sees the suffering of his people and wishes to ease it, even when doing so brings him no political advantage." Dr. Ashford spent the next hour preparing medicines and instructing Isadora on how to administer them, what signs to watch for, and when to expect his next visit. He left bottles of tinctures and powders, along with detailed written instructions that Isadora studied carefully, determined to follow them exactly. By the time he finished and packed up his satchel, Margaret had already been given the first dose of pain medicine, and the relief in her expression was evident, the tension that had held her features tight for months finally beginning to ease. When Isadora emerged from the cottage, she found Prince Theodore still in conversation with the villagers, but he broke off immediately upon seeing her, his eyes searching her face for some indication of what the physician had said. Isadora managed a small smile, nodding to convey that the news, while not entirely good, was better than they had feared, and she saw his shoulders relax slightly. "Might I have a word with you, Miss Isadora?" Prince Theodore asked, his tone formal but his eyes warm. "Perhaps you could show me the village, as I am unfamiliar with this part of my kingdom and would benefit from a local guide." The request was transparent in its intent, but the villagers seemed to accept it at face value, nodding and stepping back to allow them privacy. Isadora led Prince Theodore away from the cottage, walking along the narrow dirt paths that wound between the humble homes of Thornwick, acutely aware of the curious stares that followed them and the whispers that would surely begin the moment they were out of earshot. When they had put some distance between themselves and the watching villagers, Prince Theodore spoke quietly, his voice meant only for her ears. I could not stay away. I tried, told myself that it was madness to risk the journey here, that I had already done enough by sending the physician. But I kept thinking about you, about our conversation in the courtyard, and I needed to see you again, to know that you were real and not some fever dream conjured by wine and candlelight. I am real, Your Highness, Isidora said, her heart racing at the intimacy of his words, though sometimes I wonder if I am the one dreaming, if this entire situation is some elaborate fantasy that will dissolve when I wake. They walked in silence for a moment, following a path that led toward the edge of the village, where bare fields stretched toward a line of skeletal trees marking the beginning of the forest. The winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the frozen ground, and their breath formed clouds in the cold air that dissipated quickly in the light breeze. Dr. Ashford says your mother has months yet, if the medicines work as he hopes, Prince Theodore said after a while. That gives us time, Isidora. Time to figure out what this is between us. Time to explore whether the connection we felt at the ball was genuine or merely the product of unusual circumstances. Isidora stopped walking and turned to face him, forcing herself to confront the reality that he seemed determined to ignore. Your Highness, there can be nothing between us beyond friendship, and even that is dangerous enough. You are the crown prince, heir to the throne of England, and I am a peasant girl with no name, no family, and no prospects. The gulf between our stations is too vast to be bridged by anything as simple as mutual attraction or shared understanding. Prince Theodore reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm in a gesture that sent shivers up her arm. I have been told my entire life what I can and cannot do, who I can and cannot care about. I have been measured and weighed and found wanting by those who believe that being royal means sacrificing everything personal on the altar of duty and tradition. I am tired of it, Isidora. I am tired of pretending that I do not have desires and dreams of my own, that I exist solely to fulfill other people's expectations. But you do exist for that purpose, at least in part, Isidora said gently, her heart breaking even as she spoke the words. You will be king someday, responsible for the welfare of an entire nation. You cannot afford to let personal feelings interfere with your duty, no matter how strong those feelings might be. Can I not? Prince Theodore's voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through his careful control. Must I sacrifice every chance at happiness, every possibility of finding someone who sees me as more than just a title and a crown? My father made that choice, married for political advantage, and spent his entire life in a loveless union that left him bitter and cold. I will not follow the same path, Isidora. I cannot. Before Isidora could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention back toward the village center. A rider approached at speed, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cold, and Isidora recognized the livery of Ravencrest Castle. The messenger dismounted and bowed hastily to Prince Theodore, his face grave with whatever news he carried. Your Highness, I apologize for the intrusion, but you are needed back at the castle immediately. Your father, King Edmund, has learned of your presence here in Thornwick, and he is displeased. He has sent word that you are to return at once, and that there will be consequences if you delay. Prince Theodore's jaw tightened, and Isidora saw the conflict playing out behind his eyes, the war between his desire to stay and his obligation to obey his father's summons. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he nodded. Very well, tell His Majesty that I will return within the hour. The messenger bowed again and remounted, riding back toward Ravencrest to deliver the prince's response. When he was gone, Prince Theodore turned back to Isidora, and the anguish in his expression made her want to reach out and comfort him, though she knew such a gesture would only make their parting more difficult. I must go, he said unnecessarily. My father's anger is not something to be taken lightly, and if I defy him openly, he will find ways to punish not just me, but those I care about. I will not put you or your mother at risk because of my stubbornness. I understand, Your Highness, Isidora said, though understanding did nothing to ease the pain of watching him prepare to leave. You have already done more for us than we had any right to expect. Please, do not let your kindness toward us become a weapon your enemies can use against you. Prince Theodore took both her hands in his, holding them tightly as if he could somehow anchor himself to this moment, to this connection that had formed so unexpectedly between them. This is not over, Isidora. I will find a way to see you again. To continue what we began at the ball, my father may command my presence at court, but he does not control my heart, and I will not let him dictate who I can and cannot care about. Your Highness, please be careful, Isadora pleaded, fear for him overriding her own heartache. Do not risk your position, your future, for someone like me. I am not worth the price you will pay if you defy the king too openly. You are worth everything, Prince Theodore said fiercely, and then, heedless of who might see, he pulled her close and kissed her again, a kiss filled with desperation and longing, and the knowledge that this might be the last time they had such an opportunity. Isadora melted into his embrace, memorizing the feel of his arms around her, the taste of his lips, the scent of leather and horses and winter air that clung to his clothing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Prince Theodore rested his forehead against hers for a brief moment. I will return, he promised. No matter what obstacles my father places in my path, no matter what consequences I must face, I will find a way back to you. Then he was gone, striding back toward the village center where his men waited with the horses, leaving Isadora standing alone in the fading afternoon light, with her heart in turmoil and her mind racing with questions about what the future might hold. She watched him mount his stallion and ride away, his dark cloak billowing behind him like wings, and she wondered if she would ever see him again, or if this was the end of the impossible dream that had begun at the ball. When Isadora returned to the cottage, she found her mother sitting up in bed, looking more alert than she had in weeks, the pain medicine already working to ease her suffering. Margaret studied her daughter's face with the insight that only a parent possessed, seeing past Isadora's attempts to appear calm and collected to the emotional storm raging beneath the surface. You care for him, Margaret said softly. The prince. I can see it in your eyes, hear it in your voice when you speak of him. This is not simply gratitude for the help he has provided, is it? Isadora sank onto the edge of the bed, too exhausted to maintain the pretense any longer. I do not know what it is, Mother. I barely know him, have spent only a few hours in his company, and yet I feel as though some fundamental part of me recognizes him, as if we were meant to find each other despite the impossibility of our situations. Margaret reached out and stroked her daughter's hair, the gesture tender and achingly familiar. I felt the same way about your father all those years ago. I knew that loving him was madness, that our different stations made any real future together impossible. But I could not help myself. The heart does not always choose wisely, my darling girl, but it chooses truly, and fighting against it only brings suffering. What should I do? Isadora asked, her voice breaking on the question. How can I navigate this situation when every path forward seems to lead to heartbreak? You cannot control what others do or how this story will end, Margaret said gently. You can only control your own choices, your own actions. If Prince Theodore truly cares for you as you believe he does, he will have to decide what he is willing to sacrifice to be with you, and you will have to decide what you are willing to accept, what compromises you can live with. But whatever happens, do not let fear or shame prevent you from embracing the possibility of happiness, however fleeting it might prove to be. The weeks that followed were torturous in their uncertainty. Dr. Ashford returned each week as promised, bringing more medicines and monitoring Margaret's progress, which showed marked improvement under his care. The pain that had plagued her for months diminished to manageable levels, and the nourishment from the regular food deliveries helped restore some of her strength. She would never be fully healthy again, Dr. Ashford admitted, but she might have a year or more rather than the mere weeks Isadora had feared. But there was no word from Prince Theodore. No messages, no visits, nothing to indicate that he had meant what he said about returning to Thornwick. Isadora tried to tell herself that this was for the best, that the prince had undoubtedly come to his senses and realized the folly of pursuing a relationship with a peasant girl. His father would have impressed upon him the importance of duty and propriety, would have made clear the consequences of continuing such an inappropriate attachment. Yet despite her attempts at rationality, Isadora found herself watching the road each day, hoping against hope to see a familiar figure on horseback approaching the village. She replayed their conversations endlessly in her mind, analyzing every word and gesture for hidden meanings, trying to understand what had passed between them and whether it had been real or merely a product of the unusual circumstances surrounding the ball. The villagers of Thornwick, meanwhile, could speak of nothing but the prince's visit and his obvious interest in Isadora. Some viewed it as a source of pride, evidence that their small community had produced a young woman worthy of royal attention. Others whispered more cruel speculations, suggesting that Isidora had somehow bewitched the prince or used improper methods to secure his favor. Isidora tried to ignore both the praise and the condemnation, focusing instead on caring for her mother and preparing herself for the inevitable moment when she would have to accept that Prince Theodore was gone from her life forever. It was nearly a month after the prince's visit when everything changed. Isidora was in the village market, using some of the money that Dr. Ashford had discreetly provided to purchase supplies, when she noticed an unusual number of riders entering Thornwick. At first she thought perhaps Prince Theodore had returned, and her heart leaped with hope and fear in equal measure. But as the riders drew closer, she realized with growing dread that these were not the prince's men. At the head of the group rode Lord Percival, his thin face set in lines of cold satisfaction, and beside him was a man Isidora had never seen before, but who radiated authority and power in a way that made her instinctively afraid. This man wore the livery of the king, and the hard set of his features suggested he was not someone accustomed to having his will thwarted. The riders stopped in the village square, and Lord Percival's eyes scanned the crowd until they found Isidora. His smile was predatory as he dismounted and began walking toward her, the king's man following close behind, and Isidora felt ice spreading through her veins as she understood that whatever was happening, it was not going to be good. Lord Percival stopped directly in front of Isidora, his cold gray eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. The villagers who had been going about their business in the market square fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to occur, and a crowd began to gather at a respectful distance, watching with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Miss Isidora," Lord Percival said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "How fortunate that I have found you so easily. This is Sir Edmund Blackwood, Chief Magistrate to His Majesty King Edmund. He has traveled all the way from the royal court to speak with you on a matter of utmost importance." The man beside Lord Percival stepped forward, his bearing military and his expression unreadable. Sir Edmund was perhaps 50 years old, with iron-gray hair and a scar running down his left cheek that spoke of battles fought and won. His eyes were hard as flint as they studied Isidora, measuring and judging her in the space of a heartbeat. "Miss Isidora of Thornwick," Sir Edmund said, his voice carrying the weight of royal authority, "I am here on behalf of His Majesty the King to address a matter that has come to his attention. It has been reported that you have been engaging in inappropriate conduct with Crown Prince Theodore, that you have used your feminine wiles to manipulate him into showing you favor far beyond what your station warrants. These are serious accusations, and they require investigation." Isidora felt the blood drain from her face, but she forced herself to stand tall, to meet Sir Edmund's hard gaze without flinching. "I have done nothing improper, Sir Edmund. Prince Theodore showed kindness to me and my dying mother, nothing more. If there are those who choose to interpret his compassion as something scandalous, that speaks to their own twisted minds rather than to any wrongdoing on my part." Lord Percival laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Come now, girl, do not insult our intelligence. The prince danced with you at the ball, singled you out for attention despite your obvious low birth. He was seen speaking privately with you in the courtyard, away from proper supervision. And then, most damning of all, he traveled to this insignificant village personally to check on your welfare, bringing his own physician to treat your mother. These are not the actions of a man simply showing compassion to a subject. These are the actions of a man who has developed an inappropriate attachment." "Prince Theodore cares about all his subjects," Isidora insisted, her voice shaking despite her attempts to remain calm. "His visit here was part of his broader commitment to understanding the struggles of common people. If you choose to see something sinister in that, it is because you wish to undermine his progressive vision for the kingdom." Sir Edmund held up a hand, silencing both Isidora and Lord Percival. "The truth of the matter will be determined through proper investigation. However, His Majesty the King has decreed that you are to accompany us back to the royal court, where you will answer questions about your relationship with the prince. This is not a request, Miss Isidora. It is a command from your sovereign, and refusal will be considered treason." Panic flooded through Isidora as she realized the trap that had been laid for her. If she went with these men, she would be at the mercy of the king, a man who reportedly despised his son's progressive ideas and would have no compunction about destroying a peasant girl to teach Prince Theodore a lesson. But if she refused, she would be branded a traitor, and the consequences would fall not just on her, but on her mother and everyone in Thornwick who had shown her kindness. "My mother is ill," Isadora said desperately, grasping for any argument that might delay this nightmare. "I cannot leave her alone. She requires constant care and the medicines that Dr. Ashford has been providing. Arrangements will be made for your mother's care," Sir Edmund replied, his tone suggesting that the matter was already decided and her protests were merely an inconvenience. "Dr. Ashford will continue to attend to her, and we will ensure she has adequate food and shelter. You need not concern yourself with her welfare while you are assisting us with our inquiries." Isadora's mind raced, trying to find some escape from this impossible situation, but every option led to disaster. She could run, try to flee into the forest and disappear, but that would only confirm the accusations against her and likely result in harsh punishment for the villagers who had harbored her. She could fight, refuse to cooperate, and force them to take her by force, but that too would achieve nothing except to make her appear guilty of the crimes they alleged. In the end, she had no real choice. She was powerless, a peasant girl with no allies and no resources, facing the full might of royal authority. All she could do was cooperate and hope that somehow Prince Theodore would learn of her situation and intervene before irreparable damage was done. "Very well," Isadora said quietly, her voice hollow with defeat. "I will accompany you to court and answer whatever questions His Majesty wishes to ask. But I want assurances that my mother will be cared for properly, that she will not suffer because of this situation." "You have my word," Sir Edmund said, though his expression suggested that the word of a king's magistrate to a peasant meant little. "Now, you have 1 hour to prepare for the journey and say goodbye to your mother. We depart at midday." The hour passed in a blur of tears and desperate reassurances. Margaret, despite her improved condition, was devastated by the news that her daughter was being taken to the royal court to face accusations of impropriety with the prince. She blamed herself, insisted that if she had not pushed Isadora to attend the ball, none of this would have happened, and no amount of comfort could ease her guilt. "This is not your fault, mother," Isadora said firmly, holding the older woman's hands and trying to convey a confidence she did not feel. "I made my own choices, and I do not regret them. Prince Theodore showed me kindness when he had no obligation to do so, and if I must face consequences for accepting that kindness, then so be it. But you must promise me that you will continue taking the medicines Dr. Ashford provides, that you will eat the food they send, and that you will fight to stay alive until I return." "And if you do not return?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking on the words. "What if the king decides to make an example of you, to punish you for daring to attract his son's attention? Then you will know that I loved you with all my heart, and that every sacrifice I made was worth it, because it gave you more time, more comfort in your final days." Isadora kissed her mother's forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of herbs and illness, trying to memorize this moment in case it truly was their last. "I will return, mother. I promise you. I will find a way back to you." The journey to the royal court took 3 days of hard riding, with Isadora forced to travel on horseback despite her limited experience with such animals. Lord Percival seemed to take pleasure in her discomfort, pushing the pace harder than necessary, and making snide comments about peasants who dared to rise above their station. Sir Edmund, by contrast, maintained a professional distance, neither cruel nor kind, simply focused on executing his duty to deliver Isadora to the king. They arrived at the royal palace in the capital as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that seemed ominous rather than beautiful. The palace dwarfed even Ravencrest Castle, a sprawling complex of buildings and courtyards that spoke of centuries of accumulated power and wealth. Guards in royal livery stood at every entrance, their expressions cold and watchful, and Isadora felt the weight of hostile attention from every direction as she was led through the gates. She was taken not to the grand halls where nobles conducted their business, but to a small windowless room deep in the bowels of the palace, a space clearly designed for interrogation rather than hospitality. A single candle provided meager light, and the stone walls seemed to press in from all sides, making Isadora feel as though she had been buried alive. Sir Edmund left her there with instructions to wait, and the heavy door closed with a finality that made her chest tighten with panic. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours in that timeless space where the candle burned down slowly and was replaced by a silent guard who entered and left without speaking. Isadora paced the small room, her mind cycling through fear and anger and desperate hope that somehow Prince Theodore would learn of her imprisonment and come to her rescue. But as more time passed with no word and no visitors, she began to accept that perhaps the prince had been forbidden from interfering, or worse, that he had decided she was not worth the political cost of defending. Finally, when Isadora had nearly given up hope of anything happening that night, the door opened and a figure entered that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not Prince Theodore, as she had desperately hoped, but King Edmund himself, the man whose iron rule had shaped England for the past 30 years, and whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary even in distant villages like Thornwick. King Edmund was tall, as his son was, but where Prince Theodore carried himself with a warrior's grace, the king moved with the measured deliberation of a predator who knew his prey could not escape. His hair was iron gray, his face lined with age and the weight of decades spent wielding absolute power, and his eyes held a coldness that made Isadora want to shrink back against the wall. He wore simple clothing, a dark tunic and breeches rather than royal regalia, as if he had come to this meeting in secret, without the ceremony that usually attended his presence. "So you are the peasant girl who has bewitched my son," King Edmund said without preamble, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "You do not look like much, certainly nothing that should have captured Theodore's attention so completely. Yet, here we are, with the crown prince making a fool of himself over a nobody from nowhere, and I am forced to intervene before his infatuation causes permanent damage to the monarchy." Isadora forced herself to meet the king's cold gaze, refusing to cower despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "I have bewitched no one, Your Majesty. Prince Theodore showed kindness to me and my dying mother, nothing more." "If his compassion is so unusual in your court that it must be explained by sorcery or manipulation, that says more about the court than it does about me." The king's eyes narrowed dangerously, and for a moment Isadora thought he might strike her for her impertinence. But then, surprisingly, he laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. "You have spirit, I will grant you that. Most peasants brought before me can barely string 2 words together for fear, but you stand there and lecture me about compassion. My son would appreciate such boldness, though he fails to understand that boldness without power is merely foolishness." "What do you want from me, Your Majesty?" Isadora asked, deciding that directness was her only option. "Why have I been brought here? If you believe I have committed some crime, then charge me and let me defend myself. But these vague accusations of impropriety serve only to torture me with uncertainty." King Edmund moved closer, studying her face with an intensity that made Isadora's skin crawl. "I want you to disappear," he said bluntly. "I want you to leave England, to go somewhere far away where Theodore will never find you, where this ridiculous infatuation can die a natural death. In exchange, I will ensure that your mother receives the finest medical care available, that she lives out her remaining days in comfort rather than poverty. I will even provide you with enough gold to start a new life in France or Spain, or wherever you choose to settle. All you have to do is agree never to see my son again, never to contact him or respond if he somehow manages to track you down." The offer hung in the air between them, tempting and terrible in equal measure. Isadora could save her mother, could ensure that Margaret's final months were spent in comfort and peace, free from the pain and deprivation that had defined her life for so long. All it would cost was Isadora's own chance at happiness, the possibility of a future with Prince Theodore that had seemed impossible anyway. But even as she considered the king's proposition, Isadora felt revulsion rising in her throat. This was not salvation being offered, but a different kind of prison, one where she would spend the rest of her life knowing that she had abandoned the man she had come to care for because his father had threatened and bribed her into compliance. Could she live with that knowledge? Could she look at herself in any mirror or reflective surface without seeing a coward who had chosen security over integrity? "And if I refuse?" Isadora asked, though she already knew the answer from the cold satisfaction that flickered across the king's face. "If you refuse, then I will make certain that your mother receives no further care from Dr. Ashford or anyone else. The food deliveries will stop, the medicines will cease, and she will die in agony within weeks. Moreover, I will ensure that you are charged with attempting to seduce the crown prince through improper means, a crime that carries a penalty of public humiliation and imprisonment. Your life and your mother's life will both be destroyed, all because you were too stubborn to accept the generous offer I have made." Isadora felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, refused to give this cruel man the satisfaction of seeing her break. "You would punish an innocent woman and her dying mother simply to prevent your son from making his own choices about whom he cares for? What kind of king does such a thing? The kind of king who understands that personal feelings must be subordinated to the good of the realm." King Edmund replied coldly. "Theodore is young and idealistic, full of notions about equality and justice that have no place in the real world of politics and power. He believes he can rule with compassion and still maintain authority, that he can bridge the divide between nobility and commoners through good intentions and kind gestures. He is wrong, and if I allow this infatuation with you to continue, it will undermine everything I have built, will set a precedent that will weaken the monarchy for generations to come. So I am to be sacrificed on the altar of your political calculations," Isadora said bitterly. "My happiness, my mother's life, all of it means nothing compared to maintaining the rigid hierarchy that keeps people like you in power and people like me in chains." The king's expression hardened. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Accept my offer and save your mother, or refuse and watch everything you love crumble to dust. The choice is yours, though I think we both know what any rational person would choose in your position." King Edmund left without another word, the heavy door closing behind him with a sound like a tomb being sealed. Isadora sank to the cold stone floor, her legs no longer able to support her weight, and finally allowed the tears she had been holding back to flow freely. The cruelty of the choice before her was overwhelming, a perfect trap designed by a man who understood exactly how to exploit her love for her mother and her feelings for Prince Theodore. She could save Margaret by accepting the king's offer, but doing so would mean betraying Theodore and abandoning any possibility of the future they had begun to imagine together. Or she could refuse and stand by her principles, but that path led to her mother's death and her own destruction. There was no third option, no clever solution that would allow her to escape the king's ultimatum with both her integrity and her mother's life intact. The night stretched endlessly as Isadora wrestled with her decision, turning the problem over and over in her mind like a puzzle with no solution. She thought of her mother's face when she had left Thornwick, the fear and love mingled in Margaret's eyes, the desperate hope that her daughter would return safely. She thought of Prince Theodore's kiss in the courtyard of Ravencrest, the way his voice had trembled when he promised to find a way back to her, the genuine emotion that had transformed his stern features into something vulnerable and achingly human. How could she choose between them? How could anyone be asked to make such an impossible decision? As dawn light began to seep under the door, bringing with it the promise of the moment when she would have to give King Edmund her answer, Isadora heard sounds in the corridor outside her cell. Voices raised in argument, the clash of steel on steel, and then suddenly the door burst open and Prince Theodore stood there, his sword drawn and his face dark with fury. "Isadora," he breathed, sheathing his weapon and rushing to where she sat huddled against the wall. "Thank God I found you in time. When I learned that my father had ordered you brought to court, that he intended to force you into exile, I knew I had to act quickly." Isadora stared at him in disbelief, unable to process that he was actually there, that he had somehow discovered what his father had done and come to her rescue. "Your Highness, how did you know? How did you find me?" "Lady Beatrice," Prince Theodore said, helping Isadora to her feet with gentle hands. "She has spies throughout the court, and when she heard whispers of my father's plan, she came to me immediately. I have been searching the palace for hours, and when the guards refused to tell me where you were being held, I was forced to be more persuasive in my inquiries." Looking past Theodore into the corridor, Isadora could see several guards lying unconscious or groaning in pain, and she realized that the prince had fought his way to her, had physically battled his own father's men to reach her cell. The magnitude of what he had done, the lines he had crossed, took her breath away. "Your Highness, you have committed treason against your father, against the king," Isadora whispered, horror and gratitude warring in her chest. "You will be punished for this, possibly even stripped of your right to the throne." "I do not care," Prince Theodore said fiercely, cupping her face in his hands and forcing her to meet his storm-cloud eyes. "I will not let my father use you as a pawn in his schemes to control me." I will not stand by while he threatens your mother and tries to force you into exile simply because I dared to care for someone he considers beneath me. Whatever consequences I face for this decision, they are mine to bear, and I bear them willingly." Before Isidora could respond, more footsteps echoed in the corridor, and King Edmund appeared, flanked by a dozen armed guards whose weapons were drawn and pointed at his son. The king's face was a mask of cold fury, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Theodore, what in God's name do you think you are doing? You have assaulted my guards, invaded a secure area of the palace, and now stand in open defiance of your king. This is treason of the highest order, and even my son is not above the law." Prince Theodore stepped in front of Isidora, shielding her with his body as he faced his father with unwavering resolve. "You left me no choice, father. You kidnapped an innocent woman, threatened her dying mother, and tried to force her into exile simply to prevent me from making my own decisions about whom I care for. If standing against such tyranny is treason, then I am proud to be a traitor." The guards shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of attacking the crown prince, even under direct orders from the king. King Edmund noticed their hesitation and his expression darkened further, but before he could issue a command, another voice rang out from behind him. "Perhaps we should all take a moment to consider the implications of what is happening here before blood is shed that can never be unspilled." Everyone turned to see Lady Beatrice emerging from the shadows, her usually kind face set in lines of determination. Behind her came other nobles, men and women of influence who had apparently been summoned by the clever lady to witness this confrontation. Among them, Isidora was surprised to see Dr. Ashford, whose presence suggested that he too had been drawn into this web of court intrigue. King Edmund's eyes narrowed as he assessed this new development. "Lady Beatrice, you overstep yourself by interfering in matters that do not concern you. This is a family dispute, not a subject for public debate. With respect, Your Majesty, when the crown prince stands accused of treason, it becomes everyone's concern," Lady Beatrice replied calmly. "And when that accusation stems from his attempt to prevent his father from terrorizing an innocent young woman, the entire court has a right to know what transpired and to judge the merits of both sides." One of the nobles, a distinguished man with white hair whom Isidora did not recognize, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we have heard disturbing reports that you ordered this young woman kidnapped and threatened with exile or worse, if she did not agree to abandon your son. If these reports are true, then it is you, not Prince Theodore, who has acted inappropriately." King Edmund's face flushed with anger, but Isidora could see calculation behind his fury as he realized that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. Too many witnesses now, too many nobles whose support he needed to maintain his authority, and they were questioning his actions rather than blindly supporting him as he had expected. "This girl is a peasant who has bewitched my son with her low cunning," the king said, trying to regain the moral high ground. "I acted to protect Theodore from his own poor judgment, to prevent him from making a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I am capable of making my own decisions about my life," Prince Theodore interjected, his voice ringing with authority that matched his father's. "And I have decided that Isidora is someone I wish to know better. Someone whose character and courage have impressed me more than all the scheming nobles who populate this court. If that makes me foolish in your eyes, father, then so be it. But I will not allow you to punish her for my choices. Doctor." Ashford stepped forward, his physician's bearing lending weight to his words. "Your Majesty, if I may speak plainly, this young woman has shown nothing but devotion to her dying mother, and has conducted herself with dignity, despite facing circumstances that would break most people. I have been treating her mother for weeks now, and in all that time, I have seen no evidence of the manipulation or scheming that Lord Percival and others have alleged. She is simply a daughter who loves her mother and who happened to catch the prince's attention through no fault of her own." The assembled nobles murmured among themselves, and Isidora could see the tide of opinion shifting, could see that King Edmund's attempt to paint her as a scheming seductress was losing credibility in the face of testimony from respected figures like Dr. Ashford and Lady Beatrice. The king seemed to recognize this as well, and his expression shifted from fury to cold calculation as he reassessed his strategy. "Very well," King Edmund said after a long moment of tense silence. "It seems my son has more support for his foolishness than I anticipated, and I am not so stubborn as to fight battles I cannot win. Theodore, you may have your peasant girl for now, but understand this. If you continue down this path, if you insist on pursuing a relationship with someone so far beneath your station, there will be consequences. The nobility will never accept her as your consort, and you will spend your reign fighting against the very people whose support you need to rule effectively. Then I will fight, Prince Theodore said simply. I have spent my entire life preparing to be king, and if part of that preparation means learning to stand up for what I believe is right, even when it is unpopular, then so much the better. Isadora has shown me that the divide between nobility and commoners is not as vast as I was taught to believe, that character and worth have nothing to do with the circumstances of one's birth. If my reign is to mean anything, it must be built on that understanding. King Edmund studied his son for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained hard. You remind me of myself at your age, full of idealistic notions and convinced that will alone could reshape the world. Life has a way of tempering such certainty, Theodore, but I suppose you will have to learn that lesson on your own. He turned to Isadora, his gaze piercing. You, girl, you understand that you have placed yourself at the center of a political storm that will not end simply because my son has defended you today. There will be nobles who despise you for capturing the prince's attention, who will work tirelessly to destroy you and drive a wedge between you and Theodore. Are you prepared for that reality? Isadora met the king's stare without flinching, drawing on reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. Your Majesty, I have spent my entire life struggling against circumstances beyond my control, fighting to survive in a world that offers no mercy to people like me. If I must now fight against nobles who think themselves better than me simply because of where they were born, then at least it will be a fight worth having. I make no apologies for caring about your son, and I will not be frightened away by threats or intimidation. For just a moment, Isadora thought she saw something like respect flicker across King Edmund's face, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. Then he turned and gestured to his guards. Lower your weapons. There will be no blood shed today, but this matter is far from resolved, and all parties involved should understand that. The guards obeyed, and the tension in the corridor eased slightly, though the atmosphere remained charged with unresolved conflict. King Edmund swept past his son and Isadora without another word, his dignity intact despite the setback, and the assembled nobles slowly began to disperse, whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed. Lady Beatrice approached Isadora with a warm smile, taking the younger woman's hands in hers. You have made a powerful enemy today, my dear, but you have also gained allies. The king is not accustomed to being defied, especially not by peasant girls and rebellious sons, but perhaps it is time he learned that the world is changing, whether he wishes to acknowledge it or not. Thank you, Lady Beatrice, Isadora said, her voice thick with emotion. If not for your intervention, I do not know what would have happened. Thank Dr. Ashford as well, Lady Beatrice replied. He was the one who insisted we gather witnesses before confronting the king, knowing that Edmund would be less likely to act rashly if forced to do so in front of the court's most influential members. Your physician friend is more politically astute than he appears. Dr. Ashford inclined his head modestly. I simply applied the same logic I use in medicine. Prevention is always preferable to treatment, and preventing a tragedy seemed the wisest course of action. Prince Theodore, who had been watching these exchanges in silence, finally spoke. Isadora, I know this is overwhelming, and I know you have been through an ordeal that no one should have to endure, but I need you to understand something. What happened today changes everything. My father knows now that I will not be controlled through threats to those I care about, and that knowledge makes him dangerous in new ways. You will need to stay here at court, under my protection, because if you return to Thornwick, he may try again to use your mother against you. Isadora's heart clenched at the thought of being separated from Margaret indefinitely, but she recognized the truth in Prince Theodore's words. My mother, she said urgently, I need to know that she is safe, that your father will not take out his anger on her as a way to punish me. Doctor, Ashford will return to Thornwick immediately to check on her, Prince Theodore assured her, and I will post guards there, men loyal to me rather than to my father, to ensure that no harm comes to her. You have my word, Isadora, that your mother will be protected and cared for, no matter what political games my father decides to play. Over the following weeks, Isadora found herself navigating a world so foreign to everything she had known, that she sometimes felt as though she had stepped into someone else's life. Prince Theodore installed her in a suite of rooms in the palace, far more luxurious than anything she had ever imagined, and assigned servants to attend to her needs. He arranged for tutors to teach her reading and writing, courtly etiquette, and the complex web of politics that governed the relationships between different noble houses. The learning was difficult, and there were many moments when Isidora felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information she needed to absorb. But she approached each lesson with the same determination that had allowed her to survive years of poverty, refusing to be defeated by challenges that seemed insurmountable. And always, Prince Theodore was there, encouraging her, believing in her ability to adapt and thrive in this strange new environment. Their relationship deepened during this time, moving beyond the initial attraction that had sparked at the ball to something more substantial and lasting. They spent hours together, talking about everything from philosophy to practical governance, and Isidora found that Theodore valued her perspective precisely because it came from a life so different from his own. She did not hesitate to challenge his assumptions or point out the flaws in policies that sounded good in theory, but would fail in practice when applied to people who struggled daily for survival. And slowly, grudgingly, some members of the court began to accept her presence, if not her relationship with the prince. Lady Beatrice championed her cause openly, introducing her to other progressive nobles who shared Theodore's vision for a more equitable kingdom. Dr. Ashford brought regular reports of Margaret's improving health, the medicines and proper nutrition working small miracles, and these visits became precious moments when Isidora could connect with her old life and remember where she had come from. But there were also those who continued to despise her, who saw her as an upstart peasant who had seduced their prince through improper means. Lord Percival remained her most vocal critic, though he was careful now to couch his attacks in terms that could not be directly challenged. And King Edmund, while he had ceased his overt attempts to remove Isidora from Theodore's life, made clear through cold glances and pointed silences that he had not forgiven or forgotten what had transpired. It was nearly 3 months after her arrival at court when Prince Theodore came to her rooms one evening with an expression that was both nervous and determined. Isidora had been studying a treatise on land management, trying to understand the complex relationships between lords and their tenant farmers. But she set the book aside immediately when she saw his face. "Theodore, what is wrong? Has something happened?" He crossed the room and took her hands, pulling her gently to her feet so that they stood face to face in the warm glow of the fireplace. "Nothing is wrong, Isidora. In fact, I hope very much that something is about to be very right. I have been thinking about our situation, about the challenges we face and the opposition we have encountered, and I have come to a decision." Isidora's heart began to race, sensing that whatever he was about to say would be momentous. "What decision?" "I want to marry you," Prince Theodore said simply, his storm-cloud eyes searching her face with an intensity that took her breath away. "I know that such a union will cause scandal, that many nobles will be outraged, and that my father will likely try to prevent it through whatever means he can devise. But I also know that I have never been as certain of anything in my life as I am of my feelings for you. You are brave and intelligent and compassionate, and you see the world with clear eyes unclouded by privilege or prejudice. You would make a remarkable queen, Isidora, if you are willing to take on that burden." Tears spilled down Isidora's cheeks as she looked at this man who had risked everything for her, who had defied his father and the expectations of his entire society, because he believed that she was worth fighting for. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to embrace the impossible dream that had somehow become possible. But another part, the practical part that had kept her alive through years of hardship, forced her to consider the reality of what he was offering. "Theodore, I am honored beyond words by your proposal, but you must think carefully about what you are suggesting. If you marry me, you will alienate much of the nobility, make enemies of people whose support you need to rule effectively. Your father might even move to disinherit you, to name another heir who will be more tractable to his wishes. Are you truly willing to risk your throne, your entire future, for a peasant girl you have known for only a few months?" Prince Theodore smiled, and it was the warm, genuine smile that transformed his stern features into something almost boyish. "I have thought of nothing else for weeks, Isidora, and my answer is yes. I am willing to risk everything, because I have come to understand that a crown without the freedom to choose my own path, to live according to my own values, is a prison rather than a privilege. You have shown me what it means to have courage, to stand up for what you believe even when the cost is high. How can I ask you to be brave if I am not willing to show the same courage myself?" Isadora reached up and touched his face, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, the slight roughness of stubble that spoke of his humanity beneath the princely facade. "Then yes, Theodore. Yes, I will marry you, and I will do everything in my power to be worthy of the faith you have placed in me. Together, we will show England that the old divisions between nobility and commoners do not have to define the future, that a better world is possible if we have the courage to reach for it." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Isadora felt the last remnants of her old life falling away, replaced by something new and terrifying and wonderful. When they finally broke apart, both smiling through tears of joy, Theodore pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple band of gold set with a single emerald that matched Isadora's eyes. "This belonged to my grandmother," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "She was said to be the kindest queen England ever knew, beloved by nobles and commoners alike, because she never forgot that compassion and justice were more important than power or prestige. I like to think she would have approved of you, Isadora, that she would have recognized in you the same qualities that made her great." The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through the court, just as Theodore had predicted. Some nobles were openly hostile, demanding that the king intervene to prevent what they saw as a catastrophic mistake. Others were more cautiously supportive, recognizing that Theodore's progressive vision might actually serve the kingdom well in the long run, even if it challenged their comfortable assumptions about the social order. King Edmund, surprisingly, did not move to block the marriage, though his reasons for accepting it remained unclear. Lady Beatrice speculated that he had realized that fighting his son openly would only make Theodore more determined, and that perhaps the king saw some advantage in allowing the marriage while maintaining his disapproval, positioning himself as the voice of tradition against his son's radical reforms. Dr. Ashford brought Margaret to court for the wedding, defying the physicians who warned that the journey might prove too taxing for her weakened condition. But Margaret insisted, declaring that she would not miss her daughter's wedding even if it killed her, and her joy at seeing Isadora in her wedding gown, standing beside a prince who clearly adored her, brought color to her pale cheeks and light to her dimming eyes. The wedding itself was a grand affair, held in the great cathedral with nobles from across England in attendance, along with a significant number of common people whom Theodore had insisted be allowed to witness the ceremony. When the archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, and Theodore kissed his new princess before God and country, the cheers from the common folk drowned out the more restrained applause of the nobility. In the months that followed, Isadora threw herself into learning everything she needed to know to be an effective princess and eventual queen. She worked tirelessly alongside Theodore to implement reforms that would ease the suffering of the poorest citizens, establishing systems for distributing food and medicine to those in need, and creating opportunities for common people to learn trades and improve their circumstances. Not all of their initiatives succeeded, and they faced constant opposition from nobles who benefited from maintaining the status quo. But slowly, gradually, they began to see change taking root. Margaret lived for another year, long enough to see her daughter firmly established in her new role, long enough to hold her granddaughter, the baby girl that Isadora and Theodore named Margaret in her honor. When the older Margaret finally passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by more comfort and love than she had known in decades, Isadora mourned deeply, but also felt gratitude that her mother had lived to see the impossible dream become reality. Years passed, and when King Edmund eventually died and Theodore ascended to the throne, Isadora stood beside him as Queen of England, the peasant girl who had worn a stained silk dress to a ball and captured a prince's heart through nothing more than courage and honesty. Together, they ruled with compassion and justice, never forgetting the lessons learned from Isadora's years of poverty and struggle, always working to build a kingdom where birth did not determine destiny and where every person, regardless of station, had the opportunity to live with dignity. And on quiet evenings, when the demands of court had finally subsided and they could be alone together, Theodore would sometimes ask Isadora if she ever regretted accepting his proposal, if the burden of being queen was too heavy to bear, and she would smile and take his hand, remembering the night of the ball when she had stood terrified in a crowded hall wearing her mother's old dress, never imagining that such humble beginnings could lead to such an extraordinary ending. "No regrets," she would tell him. and she meant it with all her heart. Not a single one. Their love story became legend, told and retold across England as proof that the rigid boundaries between nobility and commoners were not as insurmountable as people believed, that courage and compassion could overcome even the most entrenched prejudices. And though they faced challenges throughout their reign, moments when the old guard tried to undermine their reforms or paint their progressive vision as naive and impractical, Theodore and Isidora never wavered in their commitment to building a better kingdom for all their subjects. The prince who had laughed at the ball, not in mockery but in genuine joy at finding someone who saw him as more than just a title and crown, had found in Isidora a partner who challenged him, supported him, and loved him not for what he represented but for who he truly was. And the peasant girl in the torn, wine-stained dress had discovered that her worth was not defined by her circumstances, but by her character, her courage, and her unwavering determination to never give up hope, even when hope seemed like the most foolish thing to cling to. Together, they proved that love could bridge any divide, that understanding could overcome prejudice, and that sometimes the most unlikely stories had the most beautiful endings. And England, slowly but surely, became a better place because a prince had the courage to see beyond the surface, and a peasant girl had the strength to believe that she deserved more than the world had offered her.